Chapter 42 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devora Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 42. Communism. But Donal did not feel that even then would he have exhausted the likelihood of discovery. That the source of the music that had so long haunted the house was an aeolian harp in a chimney that had never or scarcely been used, might be enough to satisfy some, but he wanted to know as well why, if this was a chimney, it neither had been nor was used, and to what room it was a chimney. For the question had come to him, might not the music hold some relation with the legend of the lost room? Inquiry after legendary lore had drawn nearer and nearer, and the talk about such as belonged to the castle had naturally increased. In this talk was not seldom mentioned a ghost, as yet seen at times about the place. This Donal attributed to glimpses of the earl in his restless night walks, but by the domestics, both such as had seen something and such as had not, the apparition was naturally associated with the lost chamber, as the place whence the spectre issued, and whither he returned. Donal's spare hours were now much given to his friend Andrew Comyn. The good man had so far recovered as to think himself able to work again, but he soon found it was little he could do. His strength was gone, and the exertion necessary to the lightest labour caused him pain. It was sad to watch him on his stool, now putting in a stitch, now stopping because of the cough which so sorely haunted his thin, wind-blown tent. His face had grown white and thin, and he had nearly lost his merriment, though not his cheerfulness. He never looked other than content. He had made up his mind he was not going to get better, but to go home through a lingering illness. He was ready to go, and ready to linger, as God pleased. There was nothing wonderful in this, but to some good people even, it did appear wonderful that he showed no uneasiness as to how Doory would fare when he was gone. The house was indeed their own, but there was no money in it, not even enough to pay the taxes, and if she sold it, the price would not be enough to live upon. The neighbours were severe on Andrew's imagined indifference to his wife's future, and it was in their eyes a shame to be so cheerful on the brink of the grave. Not one of them had done more than peep into the world of faith in which Andrew lived. Not one of them could have understood that for Andrew to allow the least danger of evil to his Doory would have been to behold the universe rocking on the slippery shoulders of chance. A little moan escaping her as she looked one evening into her money teapot made Donal ask her a question or two. She confessed that she had but sixpence left. Now Donal had spent next to nothing since he came, and had therefore a few pounds in hand. His father and mother had sent back what he sent them, as being in need of nothing. Sir Gibbie was such a good son to them that they were living in what they counted luxury. Robert doubted whether he was not ministering to the flesh in allowing Janet to provide beef brose for him twice in the week. So Donal was free to spend for his next neighbours, just what his people, who were grand about money, would have had him do. Never in their cottage had a penny been wasted, never one refused where was need. "An'rew," he said, and found the mother tongue here fittest, "I'm thinking ye maun be growing some short o' siller in this time o' worklessness." "'Deed I wudna wonder," answered Andrew. "Doory says naething about sic trifles." "Weel," rejoined Donal, "I thank God I has some in the ill pickle o' not being wanted, and sae in danger o' cankerin', an' atween brithers there shouldna be two purses." "Ye hae yer own folk to look efter, sir," said Andrew. "They're weel lookit efter, better nor ever they were in their lives. They're as weel off as I am mysel' up in yon grand castle. They have a friend who but for them would hae ill lived to be the great man he is the noo, an' there's naething ower muckle for him to do for them. So my siller's my ain, an' yours, An'rew, an' Doory's." The old man put him through a catechism as to his ways and means and prospects, and finding that Donal believed as firmly as himself in the care of the master, and was convinced there was nothing that the master would rather see him do with his money than help those who needed it, especially those who trusted in him, he yielded. "It's no, ye see," said Donal, "that I hae ony doubt o' the Lord's providin', gien I had failed, but he holds the thing to my hand just as muckle as gien he said, 'There's for you, Donal.' The folk o' this warl' may not approve, but you an' me kens better, An'rew. We ken there's no good in siller but to do the will o' the Lord with it, an' help to one anither is his dear wull. It's no 'at he's short o' siller himsel', but he likes to give anither a turn." "I'll take it," said the old man. "There's what I had," returned Donal. "Na, na, none o' that," said Andrew. "Ye're treatin' me like a muckle reivin' sornin' beggar, offerin' me a' that at once. Whaur syne would be the prolonged sweetness o' havin' it in portions frae yer han', as frae the neb of an angel corby sent frae very home wi' yer dinner." Here a glimmer of the old merriment shone through the worn look and pale eyes. "Na, na, sir," he went on, "jist talk the thing ower wi' Doory, an' lat her hae what she wants an' nae mair. She wudna like it. Wha kens what may come i' the meantime? Death himsel', maybe. Or see, gie Doory a 5 shillins, an' whan that's done she can lat ye ken." Donal was forced to leave it thus, but he did his utmost to impress upon Doory that all he had was at her disposal. "I had new clothes," he said, "before I came. I have all I want to eat and drink, and for books, there's a whole ancient library at my service. What possibly could I wish for more? It's a mere luxury to hand the money over to you, Doory. I'm thinking, Doory," for he had by this time got to address her by her husband's name for her, "there's nobody in this world, 'cept the unseen Lord himsel', loves your man so well as you and me; an' weel ken I, you and him would share your last wi' me. So I'm only giein' ye o' your ain good wull, an' I'll do't that, gien ye take not so long as I have." Thus adjured, and satisfied that her husband was content, the old woman made no difficulty. Chapter 42. Chapter 43 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant by George MacDonald. Chapter 43. Eppie and Kennedy. When Stephen Kennedy heard that Eppie had gone back to her grandparents, a faint hope revived in his bosom. He knew nothing of the late passage between the two parties. He but knew that she was looking sad. She might perhaps allow him to be of some service to her. Separation had fostered more and more gentle thoughts of her in his heart. He was ready to forgive her everything, and believe nothing serious against her, if only she would let him love her again. Modesty had hitherto kept him from throwing himself in her way, but he now haunted the house in the hope of catching a glimpse of her, and when she began to go again into the town, saw her repeatedly, following her to be near her, but taking care she should not see him. Partly from her self-absorption, he had succeeded in escaping her notice. At length, however, one night, he tried to summon up courage to accost her. It was a lovely moonlit night, half the street black with quaint shadows, the other half shining like sand in the yellow light. On the moony side, people standing at their doors could recognize each other 2 houses away, but on the other, friends might pass without greeting. Eppie had gone into the baker's. Kennedy had seen her go in, and stood in the shadow waiting, all but determined to speak to her. She stayed a good while, but one accustomed to wait for fish learns patience. At length she appeared. By this time, however, though not his patience, Kennedy's courage had nearly evaporated, and when he saw her he stepped under an archway, let her pass, and followed afresh. All at once resolve, which yet was no resolve, awoke in him. It was as if some one took him and set him before her. She started when he stepped in front, and gave a little cry. "Dinna be feart, Eppie," he said. "I wouldna hurt a hair o' your heid. I would rather be skinned mysel'." "Gang awa," said Eppie. "Ye hae no richt to stand in my gate." "None but the richt o' lovin' ye better nor ever," said Kennedy, "gien so be as ye'll lat me ony gate shut." The words softened her. She had dreaded reproach, if not indignant remonstrance. She began to cry. "Gien onything in my power would make the grief lighter upon ye, Eppie," he said, "ye hae but to name it. I'm no going to ask ye to marry me, for that I ken ye dinna care about. But gien I might be looked upon as a frien', if not to you, yet to yours, allowed any way to help in your trouble, I mean, I'm ready to lay me in the dirt afore ye. I hae no care for mysel' any more, an' maun do something for somebody. An' who, so soon as yoursel', Eppie?" For sole answer, Eppie went on crying. She was far from happy. She had nearly persuaded herself that all was over between her and lord Forgue, and almost she could, but for shame, have allowed Kennedy to comfort her as an old friend. Everything in her mind was so confused, and everything around her so miserable, that she could but cry. She continued crying, and as they were in a walled lane, into which no windows looked, Kennedy, in the simplicity of his heart, and the desire to comfort her, who little from him deserved comfort, came up to her, and putting his arm round her, said again, "Dinna be feart o' me, Eppie. I'm a man ower sair-hearted to do ye any hurt. It's not as thinking ye my ain, Eppie, I would presume to do anything for ye, but as an old friend, fain to take the dog off o' ye. Are ye in want of anything? Ye maun hae a heap o' trouble, I will ken, wi' your grandfather's mischance, and it's easy to understan' 'at things may well be turning scarce about ye. But be sure o' this, that as long as my mither has anything, she'll be blythe to share the same wi' you and yours." He said his mother, but she had nothing, save what he provided her with. "I thank ye, Stephen," said Eppie, touched with his goodness, "but there's no necessity. We ha' plenty." She moved on, her apron still to her eyes. Kennedy followed her. "Gien the young lord hae wronged ye any gait," he said from behind her, "an' gien there be ony amends ye would hae o' him." She turned with a quickness that was fierce, and in the dim light Kennedy saw her eyes blazing. "I want nothing frae your hand, Stephen Kennedy," she said. "My lord's nothing to you, nor yet muckle to me," she added, with sudden reaction and an outburst of self-pity, and again fell a-weeping, and sobbing now. With the timidity of a strong man before the girl he loves, and therefore fears, Kennedy once more tried to comfort her, wiping her eyes with her apron. While he did so, a man, turning a corner quickly, came almost upon them. He started back, then came nearer, looked hard at them, and spoke. It was Lord Forgue. "Eppie!" he exclaimed, in a tone in which indignation blended with surprise. Eppie gave a cry, and ran to him. He pushed her away. "My lord," said Kennedy, "the lass will none o' me or mine. I sair doubt there's none but yoursel' can please her. But I swear by God, my lord, gien ye do her any wrong, I'll no rest, night nor day, till I hae made ye repent it." "Go to the devil," said Forgue. "There's an old crow, I suspect, yet to pluck between us. For me you may take her, though. I don't go halves." Eppie laid her hand timidly on his arm, but again he pushed her away. "Oh, my lord!" she sobbed, and could say no more for weeping. "How is it I find you here with this man?" he asked. "I don't want to be unfair to you, but it looks rather bad." "My lord," said Kennedy. "Hold your tongue. Let her speak for herself." "I had no tryst with him, my lord. I never said come nigh me," sobbed Eppie. "Ye see what ye hae done!" she cried, turning in anger on Kennedy, and her tears suddenly ceasing. "Never but ill hae ye brought me. What business had ye to come after me this gait, making mischief atween my lord and me? Can a body not set foot ayond the door-sill, but they maun be followed o' them they would see far enough?" Kennedy turned and went, and Eppie with a fresh burst of tears turned to go also. But she had satisfied Forgue that there was nothing between them, and he was soon more successful than Kennedy in consoling her. While absent, he had been able enough to get on without her, but no sooner was he home than, in the weary lack of interest, the feelings which, half lamenting, half rejoicing, he had imagined extinct, began to revive, and he went to the town vaguely hoping to get a sight of Eppie. Coming upon her tête-à-tête with her old lover, first a sense of unpardonable injury possessed him, and next the conviction that he was as madly in love with her as ever. The tide of old tenderness came throbbing and streaming back over the ghastly sands of jealousy, and ere they parted he had made with her an appointment to meet the next night in a more suitable spot. Donal was seated by Andrew's bedside reading. He had now the opportunity of bringing many things before him such as the old man did not know to exist. Those last days of sickness and weakness were among the most blessed of his life. Much that could not be done for many a good man with 10 times his education, could be done for a man like Andrew Coman. Eppie had done her best to remove all traces of emotion ere she re-entered the house, but she could not help the shining of her eyes. The joy lamp relighted in her bosom shone through them, and Andrew, looking up when she entered, Donal seated with his back to her, at once knew her secret. Her grandfather read it from her face, and Donal read it from his. "She has seen Forgue," he said to himself. "I hope the old man will die soon." End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 44. High and Low. When Lord Morven heard of his son's return, he sent for Donal, received him in a friendly way, gave him to understand that, however he might fail to fall in with his views, he depended thoroughly on his honesty, and begged he would keep him informed of his son's proceedings. Donal replied that, while he fully acknowledged his lordship's right to know what his son was doing, he could not take the office of a spy. "But I will warn Lord Forgue," he concluded, "that I may see it right to let his father know what he is about. I fancy, however, he understands as much already." "Pooh! That would only be to teach him cunning," said the earl. "I can do nothing underhand," replied Donal. "I will help no man to keep an unrighteous secret, but neither will I secretly disclose it." Meeting him a few days after, Forgue would have passed him without recognition, but Donal stopped him, and said, "I believe, my lord, you have seen Eppie since your return." "What the deuce is that to you?" "I wish your lordship to understand that whatever comes to my knowledge concerning your proceedings in regard to her, I will report to your father if I see fit." "The warning is unnecessary. Few informers, however, would have given me the advantage, and I thank you. So far I am indebted to you. None the less, the shame of the informer remains. Your lordship's judgment of me is no more to me than that of yon rook up there." "You doubt my honour?" said Forgue with a sneer. "I do. I doubt you. You do not know yourself. Time will show. For God's sake, my lord, look to yourself. You are in terrible danger." "I would rather do wrong for love than right for fear. I scorn such threats." "Threats, my lord?" echoed Donal. "Is it a threat to warn you that your very consciousness may become a curse to you? That to know yourself may be your hell? That you may come to make it your first care to forget what you are? Do you know what Shakespeare says of Tarquin? 'Besides, his soul's fair temple is defaced, to whose weak ruins muster troops of cares, to ask the spotted princess how she fares.'" "Oh, hang your preaching!" cried Forgue, and turned away. "My lord," said Donal, "if you will not hear me, there are preachers you must." "They will not be quite so long-winded then," Forgue answered. "You are right," said Donal, "they will not." All Forgue's thoughts were now occupied with the question how with least danger Eppie and he were to meet. He did not contemplate treachery. At this time of his life he could not have respected himself, little as was required for that, had he been consciously treacherous. But no man who in love yet loves himself more, is safe from becoming a traitor. Potentially he is one already. Treachery to him who is guilty of it seems only natural self-preservation. The man who can do a vile thing is incapable of seeing it as it is, and that ought to make us doubtful of our judgments of ourselves, especially defensive judgments. Forgue did not suspect himself, not although he knew that his passion had but just regained a lost energy, revived at the idea of another man having the girl. It did not shame him that he had begun to forget her, or that he had been so roused to fresh desire. If he had stayed away 6 months, he would practically have forgotten her altogether. Some may think that, if he had devotion enough to surmount the vulgarities of her position and manners and ways of thought, his love could hardly be such as to yield so soon. But Eppie was not in herself vulgar. Many of even humbler education than she are far less really vulgar than some in the forefront of society. No doubt the conventionalities of a man like Forgue must have been sometimes shocked in familiar intercourse with one like Eppie, but while he was merely flirting with her, the very things that shocked would also amuse him. For I need hardly say he was not genuinely refined, and by the growing passion obscured them. There is no doubt that, had she been confronted as his wife with the common people of society, he would have become aware of many things as vulgarities which were only simplicities. But in the meantime she was no more vulgar to him than a lamb or a baby is vulgar, however unfit either for a Belgravian drawing-room. Vulgar at the same time he would have thought and felt her, but for the love that made him do her justice. Love is the opener as well as closer of eyes. But men who, having seen, become blind again, think they have had their eyes finally opened. For some time there was no change in Eppie's behaviour, but that she was not tearful as before. She continued diligent, never grumbled at the hardest work, and seemed desirous of making up for remissness in the past, when in truth she was trying to make up for something else in the present. She would atone for what she would not tell, by doing immediate duty with the greater devotion. But by and by she began occasionally to show, both in manner and countenance, a little of the old pertness, mingled with uneasiness. The phenomenon, however, was so intermittent and unpronounced as to be manifest only to eyes familiar with her looks and ways. To Donal it was clear that the relation between her and Forgue was resumed. Yet she never went out in the evening, except sent by her grandmother, and then she always came home even with haste, anxious, it might have seemed, to avoid suspicion. It was the custom with Donal and Davy to go often into the fields and woods in the fine weather. They called this their observation class, to learn what they might of the multitudinous goings-on in this or that of nature's workshops. There each for himself and the other exercised his individual powers of seeing and noting and putting together. Donal knew little of woodland matters, having been chiefly accustomed to meadows and bare hillsides, yet in the woods he was the keener of the two to observe, and could the better teach that he was but a better learner. One day, as they were walking together under the thin shade of a fir thicket, Davy said, with a sudden change of subject, "I wonder if we shall meet Forgue to-day. He gets up early now and goes out. It is neither to fish nor shoot, for he doesn't take his rod or gun. He must be watching or looking for something. Shouldn't you say so, Mr. Grant?" This set Donal thinking. Eppie was never out at night, or only for a few minutes, and Forgue went out early in the morning. But if Eppie would meet him, how could he or any one help it? Chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant by George MacDonald. Chapter 45. A Last Encounter. Now for a while Donal seldom saw Lady Arctura, and when he did, received from her no encouragement to address her. The troubled look had reappeared on her face. In her smile, as they passed in hall or corridor, glimmered an expression almost pathetic, something like an appeal, as if she stood in sore need of his help, but dared not ask for it. She was again much in the company of Miss Carmichael, and Donal had good cause to fear that the Phariseeism of her would-be directress was coming down upon her spirit, not like rain on the mown grass, but like frost on the spring flowers. The impossibility of piercing the Christian Pharisee holding the traditions of the elders in any vital part, so pachydermatous is he to any spiritual argument, is a sore trial to the old Adam still unslain in lovers of the truth. At the same time, nothing gives patience better opportunity for her perfect work. And it is well they cannot be reached by argument and so persuaded. They would but enter the circles of the faithful to work fresh schisms and breed fresh imposthumes. But Donal had begun to think that he had been too forbearing towards the hideous doctrines advocated by Miss Carmichael. It is one thing where evil doctrines are quietly held, and the truth associated with them assimilated by good people doing their best with what has been taught them, and quite another where they are forced upon some shrinking nature, weak to resist through the very reverence which is its excellence. The finer nature, from inability to think another of less pure intent than itself, is often at a great disadvantage in the hands of the coarser. He made up his mind that, risk as it was to enter into disputations with a worshipper of the letter, inasmuch as, for argument, the letter is immeasurably more available than the spirit, for while the spirit lies in the letter unperceived, it has no force, and the letter worshipper is incapable of seeing that God could not possibly mean what he makes of it. Notwithstanding the risk, he resolved to hold himself ready, and if anything was given him, to cry it out and not spare. nor had he long resolved ere the opportunity came. It had come to be known that Donal frequented the old avenue, and it was with intent, in the pride of her acquaintance with Scripture, and her power to use it, that Miss Carmichael one afternoon led her unwilling, rather recusant, and very unhappy disciple thither. She sought an encounter with him. His insolence towards the old established faith must be confounded, his obnoxious influence on Arctura frustrated. It was a bright autumnal day. The trees were sorely bereaved, but some foliage yet hung in thin yellow clouds upon their patient boughs. There was plenty of what Davy called scuishlin, that is, the noise of walking with scarce lifted feet among the thick-lying withered leaves. But less foliage means more sunlight. Donal was sauntering along, his book in his hand, now and then reading a little, now and then looking up to the half-bared branches, now and then, like Davy, sweeping a cloud of the fallen multitude before him. He was in this childish act, when, looking up, he saw the two ladies approaching. He did not see the peculiar glance Miss Carmichael threw her companion. "Behold your prophet," it said. He would have passed with lifted bonnet, but Miss Carmichael stopped, smiling. Her smile was bright, because it showed her good teeth, but was not pleasant, because it showed nothing else. "Glorying over the fallen, Mr. Grant?" she said. Donal in his turn smiled. "That is not Mr. Grant's way," said Arctura, "so far at least as I have known him." "How careless the trees are of their poor children!" said Miss Carmichael, affecting sympathy for the leaves. "Pardon me," said Donal, "if I grudge them your pity. There is nothing more of children in those leaves than there is in the hair that falls on the barber's floor." "It is not very gracious to pull a lady up so sharply," returned Miss Carmichael, still smiling. "I spoke poetically." "There is no poetry in what is not true," rejoined Donal. "Those are not the children of the tree." "Of course," said Miss Carmichael, a little surprised to find their foils crossed already. "A tree has no children, but—" "A tree no children!" exclaimed Donal. "What then are all those beech nuts under the leaves? Are they not the children of the tree?" "Yes, and lost, like the leaves," sighed Miss Carmichael. "Why do you say they are lost? They must fulfil the end for which they were made, and if so, they cannot be lost." "For what end were they made?" "I do not know. If they all grew up, they would be a good deal in the way." "Then you say there are more seeds than are required?" "How could I, when I do not know what they are required for? How can I tell that it is not necessary for the life of the tree that it should produce them all, and necessary too for the ground to receive so much life rent from the tree?" "But you must admit that some things are lost." "Yes, surely," answered Donal. "Why else should he come and look till he find?" No such answer had the theologian expected. She was not immediate with her rejoinder. "But some of them are lost after all," she said. "Doubtless. There are sheep that will keep running away. But he goes after them again." "He will not do that for ever." "He will." "I do not believe it." "Then you do not believe that God is infinite?" "I do." "How can you? Is he not the Lord God merciful and gracious?" "I am glad you know that." "But if his mercy and his graciousness are not infinite, then he is not infinite." "There are other attributes in which he is infinite." "But is he not infinite in all his attributes? He is partly infinite and partly finite, infinite in knowledge and power, but in love, in forgiveness, and all those things which are the most beautiful, the most divine, the most Christ-like, he is finite, measurable, bounded, small." "I care nothing for such finite reasoning. I take the word of inspiration, and go by that." "Let me hear then," said Donal, with an uplifting of his heart in prayer, for it seemed no light thing for Arctura which of them should show the better reason. Now it had so fallen that the ladies were talking about the doctrine called adoption, when first they saw Donal; whence this doctrine was the first to occur to the champion of orthodoxy as a weapon wherewith to foil the enemy. "The most precious doctrine, if one may say so, in the whole Bible, is that of adoption. God, by the mouth of his apostle Paul, tells us that God adopts some for his children, and leaves the rest. If because of this you say he is not infinite in mercy, when the Bible says he is, you are guilty of blasphemy." In a tone calm to solemnity, Donal answered, "God's mercy is infinite, and the doctrine of adoption is one of the falsest of false doctrines. In bitter lack of the Spirit whereby we cry Abba, Father, The so-called Church invented it, and it remains, a hideous mask wherewith false and ignorant teachers scare God's children from their Father's arms." "I hate sentiment, most of all in religion," said Miss Carmichael with contempt. "You shall have none," returned Donal. "Tell me what is meant by adoption." "The taking of children," answered Miss Carmichael, already spying a rock ahead, "and treating them as your own." "Whose children?" asked Donal. "Anyone's." "Whose," insisted Donal, "are the children whom God adopts?" She was on the rock, and a little staggered, but she pulled up courage and said, "The children of Satan." "Then how are they to be blamed for doing the deeds of their father?" "You know very well what I mean. Satan did not make them. God made them, but they sinned and fell." "Then did God repudiate them?" "Yes." "And they became the children of another?" "Yes, of Satan." "Then God disowns his children, and when they are the children of another, adopts them? Miss Carmichael, it is too foolish. Would that be like a father? Because his children do not please him, he repudiates them altogether, and then he wants them again, not as his own, but as the children of a stranger whom he will adopt. The original relationship is no longer of any force, has no weight, even with their very own father. What ground could such a parent have to complain of his children?" "You dare not say the wicked are the children of God the same as the good." "That be far from me. Those who do the will of God are infinitely more his children than those who do not. They are born of the innermost heart of God. They are then of the nature of Jesus Christ, whose glory is obedience. But if they were not in the first place, and in the most profound fact, the children of God, they could never become his children in that highest sense, by any fiction of adoption. Do you think if the devil could create, his children could ever become the children of God? But you and I, and every Pharisee, publican, and sinner in the world, are equally the children of God to begin with. That is the root of all the misery and all the hope. Because we are his children, we must become his children in heart and soul, or be forever wretched. If we cease to be his, if the relation between us were destroyed, which is impossible, no redemption would be possible. There would be nothing left to redeem." "You may talk as you see fit, Mr. Grant, but while Paul teaches the doctrine, I will hold it. He may perhaps know a little better than you." "Paul teaches no such doctrine. He teaches just what I have been saying. The word translated adoption, he uses for the raising of one who is a son to the true position of a son." "The presumption in you to say what the apostle did or did not mean!" "Why, Miss Carmichael, do you think the gospel comes to us as a set of fools? Is there any way of truly or worthily receiving a message without understanding it? A message is sent for the very sake of being in some measure at least understood. Without that it would be no message at all. I am bound by the will and express command of the Master to understand the things he says to me. He commands me to see their rectitude, because they being true, I ought to be able to see them true. In the hope of seeing as he would have me see, I read my Greek Testament every day. But it is not necessary to know Greek to see what Paul means by the so translated adoption. You have only to consider his words with intent to find out his meaning, and without intent to find in them the teaching of this or that doctor of divinity. In the epistle to the Galatians, whose child does he speak of as adopted? It is the Father's own child, his heir, who differs nothing from a slave until he enters upon his true relation to his father, the full status of a son. So also in another passage, by the same word he means the redemption of the body, its passing into the higher condition of outward things, into a condition in itself, and a home around it, fit for the sons and daughters of God, that we be no more like strangers, but like what we are, the children of the house. To use any word of Paul's to make human being feel as if he were not by birth, making, origin, or whatever word of closer import can be found, the child of God, or as if anything he had done or could do could annul that relationship, is of the devil, the father of evil, not either of Paul or of Christ. Why, my lady, continued Donal, turning to Arctura, all the evil lies in this, that he is our father, and we are not his children. To fulfill the poorest necessities of our being, we must be his children in brain and heart, in body and soul and spirit, in obedience and hope and gladness and love, his out and out, beyond all that tongue can say, mind think, or heart desire. Then only is our creation finished. Then only are we what we were made to be. This is that for the sake of which we are troubled on all sides. He ceased. Miss Carmichael was intellectually cowed, but her heart was nowise touched. She had never had that longing after closest relation with God which sends us feeling after the Father. But now, taking courage under the overshadowing wing of the divine, Arctura spoke. "I do hope what you say is true, Mr. Grant," she said with a longing sigh. "Oh yes, hope! We all hope. But it is the word we have to do with," said Miss Carmichael. "I have given you the truth of this word," said Donal. But as if she heard neither of them, Arctura went on. "If it were but true," she moaned, "it would set right everything on the face of the earth." "You mean far more than that, my lady," said Donal. "You mean everything in the human heart, which will to all eternity keep moaning and crying out for the Father of it, until it is one with its one relation." He lifted his bonnet, and would have passed on. "One word, Mr. Grant," said Miss Carmichael. "No man holding such doctrines could with honesty become a clergyman of the Church of Scotland." "Very likely," replied Donal. "Good afternoon." "Thank you, Mr. Grant," said Arctura. "I hope you are right." When he was gone, the ladies resumed their walk in silence. At length Miss Carmichael spoke. "Well, I must say, of all the conceited young men I have had the misfortune to meet, your Mr. Grant bears the palm. Such self-assurance! Such presumption! Such forwardness!" "Are you certain, Sophia," rejoined Arctura, "that it is self-assurance and not conviction that gives him his courage?" "He is a teacher of lies. He goes dead against all that good men say and believe. The thing is as clear as daylight. He is altogether wrong." "What if God be sending fresh light into the minds of his people?" "The old light is good enough for me." "But it may not be good enough for God. What if Mr. Grant should be his messenger to you and me?" "A likely thing! A raw student from the hills of Daurside!" "I cherish a profound hope that he may be in the right. Much good, you know, did come out of Galilee. Every place and every person is despised by somebody." "Arctura! He has infected you with his frightful irreverence." "If he be a messenger of Jesus Christ," said Arctura quietly, "he has had from you the reception he would expect, for the disciple must be as his master." Miss Carmichael stood still abruptly. Her face was in a flame, but her words came cold and hard. "I am sorry," she said, "our friendship should come to so harsh a conclusion, Lady Arctura. But it is time it should end, when you speak so to one who has been doing her best for so long to enlighten you. If this be the first result of your new gospel, well! Remember who said, 'If an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than I have preached, let him be accursed.'" She turned back. "Oh, Sophia, do not leave me so!" cried Arctura. But she was already yards away, her skirt making a small whirlwind that went after her through the withered leaves. Arctura burst into tears, and sat down at the foot of one of the great beeches. Miss Carmichael never looked behind her. She met Donal again, for he too had turned. He uncovered, but she took no heed. She had done with him. Her poor Arctura! Donal was walking gently on, thinking with closed book, when the wind bore to his ear a low sob from Arctura. He looked up and saw her. She sat weeping like one rejected. He could not pass or turn and leave her thus. She heard his steps in the withered leaves, glanced up, dropped her head for a moment, then rose with a feeble attempt at a smile. Donal understood the smile. She would not have him troubled because of what had taken place. "Mr. Grant," she said, coming towards him, "St. Paul laid a curse upon even an angel from heaven if he preached any other gospel than his. It is terrible." "It is terrible, and I say amen to it with all my heart," returned Donal. "But the gospel you have received is not the gospel of Paul. It is one substituted for it, and that by no angel from heaven, but by men with hide-bound souls, who in order to get them into their own intellectual pockets melted down the ingots of the kingdom, and recast them in moulds of wretched legalism, borrowed of the Romans who crucified their master. Grand, childlike, heavenly things they must explain, forsooth, after vulgar worldly notions of law and right. But they meant well, seeking to justify the ways of God to men, therefore the curse of the apostle does not fall, I think, upon them. They sought a way out of their difficulties, and thought they had found one, when in reality it was their faith in God himself that alone got them out of the prison of their theories. but gladly would I see discomfited such as, receiving those inventions at the 100th hand, and moved by none of the fervour with which they were first promulgated, lay, as the word and will of God, lumps of iron and heaps of dust upon live, beating, longing hearts that cry out after their God." "Oh, I do hope what you say is true," panted Arctura. "I think I shall die if I find it is not." "If you find what I tell you untrue, it will only be that it is not grand and free and bounteous enough. To think anything too good to be true is to deny God, to say the untrue may be better than the true, that there might be a greater God than he. Remember, Christ is in the world still, and within our call." "I will think of what you tell me," said Arctura, holding out her hand. "If anything in particular troubles you," said Donal, "I shall be most glad to help you if I can. But it is better there should not be much talking. The thing lies between you and your father." With these words he left her. Arctura followed slowly to the house, and went straight to her room, her mind filling as she went with slow reviving strength and a great hope. No doubt some of her relief came from the departure of her incubus friend, but that must soon have vanished in fresh sorrow, save for the hope and strength to which this departure yielded the room. She trusted that by the time she saw her again, she would be more firmly grounded concerning many things, and able to set them forth aright. She was not yet free of the notion that you must be able to defend your convictions. She scarce felt at liberty to say she believed a thing, so long as she knew an argument against it which she could not show to be false. Alas for our beliefs if they go no farther than the poor horizon of our experience or our logic, or any possible wording of the beliefs themselves! Alas for ourselves if our beliefs are not what we shape our lives, our actions, our aspirations, our hopes, our repentances by! Donal was glad indeed to hope that now at length an open door stood before the poor girl. He had been growing much interested in her, as one on whom life lay heavy, one who seemed ripe for the kingdom of heaven, yet in whose way stood one who would neither enter herself, nor allow her to enter that would. She was indeed fit for nothing but the kingdom of heaven, so much was she already the child of him whom, longing after him, she had not yet dared to call her father. His regard for her was that of the gentle strong towards the weak he would help, and now that she seemed fairly started on the path of life, the path, namely, to the knowledge of him who is the life, his care over her grew the more tender. It is the part of the strong to serve the weak, to minister that whereby they too may grow strong. But he rather than otherwise avoided meeting her, and for a good many days they did not so much as see each other. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 46. A Horrible Story. The health of the Earl remained fluctuating. Its condition depended much on the special indulgence. There was hardly any sort of narcotic with which he did not at least make experiment, if he did not indulge in it. He made no pretence, even to himself, of seeking therein the furtherance of knowledge. He wanted solely to find how this or that, thus or thus modified or combined, would contribute to his living a life such as he would have it, and other quite than that ordered for him by a power which least of all powers he chose to acknowledge. The power of certain drugs he was eager to understand. The living source of him and them and their correlations he scarcely recognized. This came of no hostility to religion other than the worst hostility of all, that of a life irresponsive to its claims. He believed neither like saint nor devil. He believed and did not obey. He believed and did not yet tremble. The one day he was better, the other worse, according, as I say, to the character and degree of his indulgence. At one time it much affected his temper, taking from him all mastery of himself. At another made him so dull and stupid that he resented nothing except any attempt to rouse him from his hebitude. Of these differences he took unfailing note, but the worst influence of all was a constant one, and of it he made no account. However the drugs might vary in their operations upon him, to one thing they all tended, the destruction of his moral nature. Urged more or less all his life by a sort of innate rebellion against social law, he had done great wrongs. Whether also committed what are called crimes, I cannot tell. No repentance had followed the remorse their consequences had sometimes occasioned. And now the possibility of remorse even was gradually forsaking him. Such a man belongs rather to the kind demoniacal than the kind human. Yet so long as nothing occurs giving to his possible an occasion to embody itself in the actual, he may live honoured, and die respected. There is always, not the less, the danger of his real nature, or rather unnature, breaking out in this way or that diabolical. Although he went so little out of the house, and apparently never beyond the grounds, he yet learned a good deal at times of things going on in the neighbourhood. Davy brought him news, so did Simmons, and now and then he would have an interview with his half-acknowledged relative, the factor. One morning before he was up, he sent for Donal, and requested him to give Davy a half-holiday, and do something for him instead. "You know, or perhaps you don't know, that I have a house in the town," he said, "the only house indeed now belonging to the earldom, a not very attractive house which you must have seen, on the main street, a little before you come to the Morven Arms." "I believe I know the house, my lord," answered Donal, "with strong iron stanchions to the lower windows, and—" "Yes, that is the house, and I dare say you have heard the story of it. I mean how it fell into its present disgrace. The thing happened more than 100 years ago, but I have spent some nights in it myself, notwithstanding." "I should like to hear it, my lord," said Donal. "You may as well have it from myself as from another. It does not touch any of us, for the family was not then represented by the same branch as now. I might else be thin-skinned about it. No mere legend, mind you, but a very dreadful fact, which resulted in the abandonment of the house. I think it time for my part that it should be forgotten and the house let. It was before the castle and the title parted company. That is a tale worth telling too. There was little fair play in either. But I will not trouble you with it now. Into the generation then above ground," the earl began, assuming a book tone the instant he began to narrate, "by one of those freaks of nature specially strange and more inexplicable than the rest, had been born an original savage. You know that the old type, after so many modifications have been wrought upon it, will sometimes reappear in its ancient crudity amidst the latest development of the race, animal and vegetable too, I suppose. Well, so it was now. I use no figure of speech when I say that the apparition, the phenomenon, was a savage. I do not mean that he was an exceptionally rough man for his position, but for any position in the Scotland of that age. No doubt he was regarded as a madman, and used as a madman, but my opinion is the more philosophical, that, by an arrest of development, into the middle of the ladies and gentlemen of the family came a veritable savage, and one out of no darkest age of history, but from beyond all record, out of the awful prehistoric times." His lordship visibly and involuntarily shuddered, as at the memory of something he had seen. Into that region he had probably wandered in his visions. "He was a fierce and furious savage, worse than anything you can imagine. The only sign of any influence of civilization upon him was that he was cowed by the eye of his keeper. Never, except by rarest chance, was he left alone and awake. No one could tell what he might not do. He was of gigantic size, with coarse black hair, the brawniest fellow and the ugliest, they say, for you may suppose my description is but legendary, there is no portrait of him on our walls, with a huge, shapeless, cruel, greedy mouth." As his lordship said the words, Donal, with involuntary insight, saw both cruelty and greed in the mouth that spoke, though it was neither huge nor shapeless. Lips hideously red and large, with the whitest teeth inside them. "I give you the description," said his lordship, who evidently lingered, not without pleasure, on the details of his recital, "just as I used to hear it from my old nurse, who had been all her life in the family, and had it from her mother, who was in it at that time. His great passion, his keenest delight, was animal food. He ate enormously, more, it was said, than 3 hearty men. An hour after he had gorged himself, he was ready to gorge again. Roast meat was his main delight, but he was fond of broth also. He must have been more like Mrs. Shelley's creation in Frankenstein than any other. All the time I read that story, I had the vision of my far-off cousin constantly before me, as I saw him in my mind's eye when my nurse described him, and often I wondered whether Mrs. Shelley could have heard of him. In an earlier age and more practical, they would have got rid of him by readier and more thorough means, if only for shame of having brought such a being into the world. But they sent him with his keeper, a little man with a powerful eye, to that same house down in the town there. In an altogether solitary place they could persuade no man to live with him. At night he was always secured to his bed, otherwise his keeper would not have had courage to sleep, for he was as cunning as he was hideous. When he slept during the day, which he did frequently after a meal, his attendant contented himself with locking his door and keeping his ears awake. At such times only did he venture to look on the world. He would step just outside the street door, but would neither leave it nor shut it behind him, lest the savage should perhaps escape from his room, bar it, and set the house on fire. One beautiful Sunday morning, the brute, after a good breakfast, had fallen asleep on his bed, and the keeper had gone downstairs and was standing in the street with the door open behind him. All the people were at church, and the street was empty as a desert. He stood there for some time, enjoying the sweet air and the scent of the flowers, went in and got a light to his pipe, put coals on the fire, saw that the huge cauldron of broth which the cook had left in his charge when he went to church — it was to serve for dinner and supper both — was boiling beautifully, went back, and again took his station in front of the open door. Presently came a neighbour woman from her house, leading by the hand a little girl too young to go to church. She stood talking with him for some time. Suddenly she cried, "Good Lord, what's come of the bairn?" The same instant came one piercing shriek, from some distance it seemed. The mother darted down the neighbouring close, but the keeper saw that the door behind him was shut, and was filled with horrible dismay. He darted to an entrance in the close, of which he always kept the key about him, and went straight to the kitchen. There by the fire stood the savage, gazing with a fixed, fishy eye of rapture at the cauldron, which the steam, issuing in little sharp jets from under the lid, showed to be boiling furiously, with the grand prophecy of broth. Ghastly horror in his very bones, the keeper lifted the lid, and there, beside the beef, with the broth bubbling in waves over her, lay the child. The demon had torn off her frock, and thrust her into the boiling liquid. There rose such an outcry that they were compelled to put him in chains and carry him no one knew whither, but nurse said he lived to old age. Ever since, the house has been uninhabited, with, of course, the reputation of being haunted. If you happen to be in its neighbourhood when it begins to grow dark, you may see the children hurry past it in silence, now and then glancing back in dread, lest something should have opened the never-opened door, and be stealing after them. They call that something the Red Ettin. Only this ogre was black, I am sorry to say. Red was the proper colour for him. "It is a horrible story," said Donal. "I want you to go to the house for me. You do not mind going, do you?" "Not in the least," answered Donal. "I want you to search a certain bureau there for some papers. By the way, have you any news to give me about Forgue?" "No, my lord," answered Donal. "I do not even know whether or not they meet, but I am afraid." "Oh, I dare say," rejoined his lordship. "The whim is wearing off. One pellet drives out another. Behind the love in the pop-gun came the conviction that it would be simple ruin. But we Grahams are stiff-necked both to God and man, and I don't trust him much." "He gave you no promise, if you remember, my lord." "I remember very well. Why the deuce should I not remember? I am not in the way of forgetting things. No, by God, nor forgiving them either. Where there's anything to forgive, there's no fear of my forgetting." He followed the utterance with a laugh, as if he would have it pass for a joke, but there was no ring in the laugh. He then gave Donal detailed instructions as to where the bureau stood, how he was to open it with a curious key which he told him where to find in the room, how also to open the secret part of the bureau in which the papers lay. "Forget?" he echoed, turning and sweeping back on his trail. "I have not been in that house for 20 years. You can judge whether I forget. No," he added with an oath, "if I found myself forgetting, I should think it time to look out. But there is no sign of that yet, thank God. There, take the keys and be off. Simmons will give you the key of the house. You had better take that of the door in the close. It is easier to open." Donal went away, wondering at the pleasure his frightful tale afforded the earl. He had seemed positively to gloat over the details of it. These were much worse than I have recorded. He showed special delight in narrating how the mother took the body of her child out of the pot. He sought Simmons and asked him for the key. The butler went to find it, but returned saying he could not lay his hands upon it. There was, however, the key of the front door. It might prove stiff. Donal took it, and having oiled it well, set out for Morven House. But on his way he turned aside to see the Comins. Andrew looked worse, and he thought he must be sinking. The moment he saw Donal, he requested they might be left alone for a few minutes. "My young friend," he said, "the Lord has favoured me greatly in granting my last days the light of your countenance. I hae learnt a heap frae you, and I kenna how I could come at wanting you." An'rew," interrupted Donal, "I dinna weel ken how that can be, for it aye seemed to me ye had all the knowledge 'at was gone." "The man can ill teach who's not gone on learning, and maybe whiles he learns mair frae his scholar nor the scholar learns frae him. But it's all frae the Lord. The Lord is that spirit, and first o' all the spirit of obedience, wi'oot which there's no learning. Still, my son, it may comfort ye a wee in the time to come, to think the old cobbler An'rew Comyn gaed into the new world fitter company for the help ye gied him afore he gaed. May the Lord make a sight o' use o' ye. Folk say a heap about saving souls, but ower often, I doubt, they help to take frae them the sense o' hoo sair they're in want o' saving. Surely a man should ken in himself mair and mair the need o' being saved, till he cries out and shouts, 'I am saved, for there's none in heaven but thee, and there's none upon the earth I desire besides thee. Man, woman, child, and live cratur is but a portion o' thee, whereon to let the love o' thee run ower.' When a man can say that, he's saved, and not till then, though for long years he may have been aye coming nearer to that goal of a hope, the heart of the Father o' me, and you, and Doory, and Eppie, and all the nations of the earth." He stopped weary, but his eyes, fixed on Donal, went on where his voice had ended, and for a time Donal seemed to hear what his soul was saying, and to hearken with content. But suddenly their light went out. The old man gave a sigh, and said, "It's ower for this world, my friend. It's comin', the hour o' darkness. But the thing 'at's true when the light shines is as true in the dark. Ye cannot work, that's all. God'll gie me grace to lie still. It's all one. I would lie just as I used to sit in the days when I mended folks' shoon, and Doory happened to take away the light for a moment. I would sit aye looking down through the mirk at my work, though I couldn't see a stime of it, the Alison in my hand ready to put in the next stick the moment the light fell upon the spot where it was to gang. That's how I would lie when I'm dayin', just waiting for the light, not for the dark, and making an incense offering o' my patience when I had nothing ither to offer, neither thought nor gladness nor sorrow, nothing but patience, burning, and pain. He'll accept that. For my son, the Master's just as easy to please as he's ill to satisfy. Ye hae seen a mither o'er her wee lassie's sampler. She'll praise it, and be right pleased with it. But how gin she was to be content with the thing in her hand? The lassie's man, when she came to have one, would have an ill time of it with his hoes and his sarks. But now I have a favour to beg o' ye, not for my sake, but for hers. Gin ye hae the warning, ye'll be with me when I gang? It may be a comfort to mysel', I dinna ken. None can tell it hasna died afore, nor even then, for deaths are so different. Doubtless Lazarus's two deaths were frae far alike. But it'll be a great comfort to Doory, I'm clear upon that. She winna find herself so lonesome like, losing sight o' her old man, gin the friend of his heart be aside her when he gangs." "Please God, I'll be at your command," said Donal. "No cry upon Doory, for I wouldna see less o' her nor I may. It may be years afore I get sight o' her loving face again, but the same Lord's in her and in me, and we canna far be sunnert, however long the time afore we meet again." Donal called Doory, and took his leave. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant by George MacDonald. Chapter 47. Morven House. Opposite Morven House was a building which had at one time been the stables to it, but was now part of a brewery. A high wall shut it off from the street. It was dinner time with the humbler people of the town, and there was not a soul visible when Donal put the key in the lock of the front door, opened it, and went in. He had timed his entrance so, desiring to avoid idle curiosity, and bring no gathering feet about the door. Almost on tiptoe he entered the lofty hall, high above the first story. The dust lay thick on a large marble table. But what was that? A streak across it, brushed sharply through the middle of the dust. It was strange, but he would not wait to speculate on the agent. The room to which the earl had directed him was on the first floor, and he ascended to it at once, by the great oak staircase which went up the sides of the hall. The house had not been dismantled, although things had at different times been taken from it, and when Donal opened a leaf of shutter, he saw tables and chairs and cabinets inlaid with silver and ivory. The room looked stately, but everything was deep in dust. Carpets and curtains were thick with the deserted sepulchres of moths, and the air somehow suggested a tomb. Donal thought of the tombs of the kings of Egypt before ravaging conquerors broke into them, when they were yet full of all such gorgeous furniture as great kings desired, against the time when the soul should return to reanimate the bodies, so carefully spiced and stored to welcome them, and the great kings would be themselves again, with the added wisdom of the dead and judged. Conscious of a curious timidity, feeling a kind of awesomeness about every form in the room, he stepped softly to the bureau, applied its key, and following carefully the directions the earl had given him, for the lock was Italian, with more than one quip and crank and wanton wile about it, succeeded in opening it. He had no difficulty in finding its secret place, nor the packet concealed in it, but just as he laid his hands on it, he was aware of a swift passage along the floor without, past the door of the room, and apparently up the next stair. There was nothing he could distinguish as footsteps, or as the rustle of a dress. It seemed as if he had heard but a disembodied motion. He darted to the door, which he had by habit closed behind him, and opened it noiselessly. The stairs above as below were covered with thick carpet. Any light human foot might pass without a sound. Only haste would murmur the secret to the troubled air. He turned, replaced the packet, and closed the bureau. If there was anyone in the house, he must know it, and who could tell what might follow? It was the merest ghost of a sound he had heard, but he must go after it. Some intruder might be using the earl's house for his own purposes. Going softly up, he paused at the top of the second stair and looked around him. An iron-clenched door stood nearly opposite the head of it, and at the farther end of a long passage, on whose sides were several closed doors, was one partly open. From that direction came the sound of a little movement, and then of low voices, one surely that of a woman. It flashed upon him that this must be the trysting-place of Eppy and Forgue. Fearing discovery before he should have gathered his wits, he stepped quietly across the passage to the door opposite, opened it, not without a little noise, and went in. It was a strange-looking chamber he had entered, that doubtless once occupied by the ogre, the Red Etin. Even in the bewilderment of the moment, the tale he had just heard was so present to him that he cast his eyes around, and noted several things to confirm the conclusion. But the next instant came from below what sounded like a thundering knock at the street door, a single knock, loud and fierce, possibly a mere runaway's knock. The start it gave Donal set his heart shaking in his bosom. Almost with it came a little cry, and the sound of a door pulled open. Then he heard a hurried yet carefully soft step, which went down the stair. "Now is my time," said Donal to himself. "She is alone." He came out, and went along the passage. The door at the end of it was open, and Eppy stood in it. She saw him coming, and gazed with wide-spread eyes of terror as if it were the Red Etin himself, waked and coming to devour her. As he came, her blue eyes opened wider, and seemed to fix in their orbits. Just as her name was on his lips, she dropped with a sharp moan. He caught her up, and hurried with her down the stair. As he reached the first floor, he heard the sound of swift ascending steps, and the next moment was face to face with Forgue. The youth started back, and for a moment stood staring. His enemy had found him. But rage restored to him his self-possession. "Put her down, you scoundrel!" he said. "She can't stand," Donal answered. "You've killed her, you damned spy!" "Then I have been more kind than you." "What are you going to do with her?" "Take her home to her dying grandfather." "You've hurt her, you devil! I know you have." "She is only frightened. She is coming to herself. I feel her waking." "You shall feel me presently," cried Forgue. "Put her down, I say." Neither of them spoke loud, for dread of neighbours. Eppie began to writhe in Donal's arms. Forgue laid hold of her, and Donal was compelled to put her down. She threw herself into the arms of her lover, and was on the point of fainting again. "Get out of the house," said Forgue to Donal. "I am here on your father's business," returned Donal. "A spy and informer!" "He sent me to fetch him some papers." "It is a lie," said Forgue. "I see it in your face." "So long as I speak the truth," rejoined Donal, "it matters little that you should think me a liar. But, my lord, you must allow me to take Eppie home." "A likely thing!" answered Forgue, drawing Eppie closer, and looking at him with contempt. "Give up the girl," said Donal sternly, "or I will raise the town, and have a crowd about the house in 3 minutes." "You are the devil!" cried Forgue. "There! Take her, with the consequences! If you had let us alone, I would have done my part. Leave us now, and I'll promise to marry her. If you don't, you will have the blame of what may happen, not I." "But you will, dearest?" said Eppie, in a tone terrified and beseeching. Gladly she would have had Donal hear him say he would. Forgue pushed her from him. She burst into tears. He took her in his arms again, and soothed her like a child, assuring her he meant nothing by what he had said. "You are my own," he went on. "You know you are, whatever our enemies may drive us to. Nothing can part us. Go with him, my darling, for the present. The time will come when we shall laugh at them all. If it were not for your sake, and the scandal of the thing, I would send the rascal to the bottom of the stair. But it is better to be patient." Sobbing bitterly, Eppie went with Donal. Forgue stood shaking with impotent rage. When they reached the street, Donal turned to lock the door. Eppie darted from him, and ran down the close, thinking to go in again by the side door. But it was locked, and Donal was with her in a moment. "You go home alone, Eppie," he said. "It will be just as well I should not go with you. I must see lord Forgue out of the house." "Eh, you winnot hurt him," pleaded Eppie. "Not if I can help it. I don't want to hurt him. You go home. It will be better for him as well as you." She went slowly away, weeping, but trying to keep what show of calm she could. Donal waited a minute or two, went back to the front door, entered, and hastening to the side door took the key from the lock. Then returning to the hall, he cried from the bottom of the stair, "My lord, I have both the keys. The side door is locked. I am about to lock the front door, and I do not want to shut you in. Pray come down." Forgue came leaping down the stair, and threw himself upon Donal in a fierce attempt after the key in his hand. The sudden assault staggered him, and he fell on the floor with Forgue above him, who sought to wrest the key from him. But Donal was much the stronger. He threw his assailant off him, and for a moment was tempted to give him a good thrashing. From this the thought of Eppie helped to restrain him, and he contented himself with holding him down till he yielded. When at last he lay quiet, "Will you promise to walk out if I let you up?" said Donal. "If you will not, I will drag you into the street by the legs." "I will," said Forgue, and getting up, he walked out and away without a word. Donal locked the door, forgetting all about the papers, and went back to Andrew's. There was Eppie, safe for the moment. She was busy in the outer room, and kept her back to him. With a word or two to the grandmother he left them, and went home revolving all the way what he ought to do. Should he tell the earl, or should he not? Had he been a man of rectitude, he would not have hesitated a moment. But knowing he did not care what became of Eppie, so long as his son did not marry her, he felt under no obligation to carry him the evil report. The father might have a right to know, but had he a right to know from him? A noble nature finds it almost impossible to deal with questions on other than the highest grounds. Where those grounds are unrecognized, the relations of responsibility may be difficult indeed to determine. All Donal was able to conclude on his way home, and he did not hurry, was that, if he were asked any questions, he would speak out what he knew, be absolutely open. If that should put a weapon in the hand of the enemy, a weapon was not the victory. Chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 48. Paternal Revenge. No sooner had he entered the castle, where his return had been watched for, than Simmons came to him with the message that his lordship wanted to see him. Then first Donal remembered that he had not brought the papers. Had he not been sent for, he would have gone back at once to fetch them. As it was, he must see the earl first. He found him in a worse condition than usual. His last drug, or combination of drugs, had not agreed with him, or he had taken too much, with correspondent reaction. He was in a vile temper. Donal told him he had been to the house, and had found the papers, but had not brought them, had in fact forgotten them. "A pretty fellow you are!" cried the earl. "What, you left those papers lying about where any rascal may find them and play the deuce with them?" Donal assured him they were perfectly safe, under the same locks and keys as before. "You are always going about the bush!" cried the earl. "You never come to the point. How the devil was it you locked them up again? To go prying all over the house, I suppose." Donal told him as much of the story as he would hear. Almost immediately he saw whither it tended, he began to abuse him for meddling with things he had nothing to do with. What right had he to interfere with Lord Forgue's pleasures? Things of the sort were to be regarded as non-existent. The linen had to be washed, but it was not done in the great court. Lord Forgue was a youth of position. Why should he be balked of his fancy? It might be at the expense of society. Donal took advantage of the first pause to ask whether he should not go back and bring the papers. He would run all the way, he said. "No, damn you," answered the earl. "Give me the keys, all the keys, house keys and all. I should be a fool myself to trust such a fool again." As Donal was laying the last key on the table by his lordship's bedside, Simmons appeared, saying Lord Forgue desired to know if his father would see him. "Oh, yes, send him up!" cried the earl in a fury. "All the devils in hell at once!" His lordship's rages came up from abysses of misery no man knew but himself. "You go into the next room, Grant," he said, "and wait there till I call you." Donal obeyed, took a book from the table, and tried to read. He heard the door to the passage open and close again, and then the sounds of voices. By degrees they grew louder, and at length the earl roared out, so that Donal could not help hearing, "I'll be damned soul and body in hell, but I'll put a stop to this! Why, you son of a snake, I have but to speak the word, and you are— Well, what? Yes, I will hold my tongue, but not if he crosses me. By God, I have held it too long already, letting you grow up the damnablest ungrateful dog that ever snuffed carrion, and your poor father perilling his soul for you, by God, you rascal!" "Thank heaven you cannot take the title from me, my lord," said Forgue coolly. "The rest you are welcome to give to Davy. It won't be too much, by all accounts." "Damn you and your title! A pretty title! Ha, ha, ha! Why, you infernal fool, you have no more right to the title than the beggarly kitchen maid you would marry. If you but knew yourself, you would crow in another fashion. Ha, ha, ha!" At this Donal opened the door. "I must warn your lordship," he said, "that if you speak so loud I shall hear every word." "Hear and be damned to you! That fellow there, you see him standing there, the mushroom that he is! Good God, how I loved his mother! And this is the way he serves me! But there was a providence in the whole affair. Never will I disbelieve in a providence again. It all comes out right, perfectly right. Small occasion had I to be breaking heart and conscience over it ever since she left me. Hang the pinchbeck rascal! He's no more Forgue than you are, Grant, and never will be Morven if he live 100 years. He's not a short straw better than any bastard in the street. His mother was the loveliest woman ever breathed, and loved me. Ah, God, it is something after all to have been loved so, and by such a woman. A woman, by God, ready and willing and happy to give up everything for me. Everything, do you hear, you damned rascal? I never married her. Do you hear, Grant? I take you to witness. Mark my words. We, that fellow's mother and I, were never married. By no law, Scotch or French or Dutch or what you will. He's a damned bastard, and may go about his business when he pleases. Oh yes, pray do. Marry your scullion when you please. You are your own master. Entirely your own master. Free as the wind that blows to go where you will and do what you please. I wash my hands of you. You'll do as you please, will you? Then do, and please me. I desire no better revenge. I only tell you once for all, the moment I know for certain you've married the wench, that moment I publish to the world, That is, I acquaint certain gossips with the fact that the next Lord Morven will have to be hunted for like a truffle. Ha ha ha!" He burst into a fiendish fit of laughter, and fell back on his pillow, dark with rage and the unutterable fury that made of his being a volcano. The two men had been standing dumb before him, Donal pained for the man on whom this phial of devilish wrath had been emptied, he white and trembling with dismay, an abject creature, crushed by a cruel parent. When his father ceased, he still stood, still said nothing. Power was gone from him. He grew ghastly, uttered a groan, and wavered. Donal supported him to a chair. He dropped into it, and leaned back with streaming face. It was miserable to think that one capable of such emotion concerning the world's regard should be so indifferent to what alone can affect a man, the nature of his actions, so indifferent to the agony of another as to please himself at all risk to her, although he believed he loved her, and perhaps did love her better than anyone else in the world. For Donal did not at all trust him regarding Eppie, less now than ever. But these thoughts went on in him almost without his thinking them. His attention was engrossed with the passionate creatures before him. The father, too, seemed to have lost the power of motion, and lay with eyes closed, breathing heavily. But by and by he made what Donal took for a sign to ring the bell. He did so, and Simmons came. The moment he entered, and saw the state his master was in, he hastened to a cupboard, took thence a bottle, poured from it something colourless, and gave it to him in water. It brought him to himself. He sat up again, and in a voice hoarse and terrible said, "Think of what I have told you, Forgue. Do as I would have you, and the truth is safe. Take your way without me, and I will take mine without you. Go." Donal went. Forgue did not move. What was Donal to do or think now? Perplexities gathered upon him. Happily there was time for thought, and for prayer, which is the highest thinking. Here was a secret affecting the youth his enemy, and the boy his friend, affecting society itself, that society which, largely capable and largely guilty of like sins, yet visits with such unmercy the sins of the fathers upon the children, the sins of the offender upon the offended. But there is another who visits them, and in another fashion. What was he to do? Was he to hold his tongue and leave the thing as not his, or to speak out as he would have done had the case been his own? Ought the chance to be allowed the nameless youth of marrying his cousin? Ought the next heir to the lordship to go without his title? Had they not both a claim upon Donal for the truth? Donal thought little of such things himself, but did that affect his duty in the matter? He might think little of money, but would he therefore look on while a pocket was picked? On reflection he saw, however, that there was no certainty the earl was speaking the truth. For anything he knew of him, he might be inventing the statement in order to have his way with his son. For in either case he was a double-dyed villain, and if he spoke the truth, was none the less capable of lying. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant by George MacDonald. Chapter 49. Filial Response. One thing then was clear to Donal, that for the present he had nothing to do with the affair. Supposing the earl's assertion true, there was at present no question as to the succession. Before such question could arise, Forgue might be dead. Before that, his father might himself have disclosed the secret, while, the longer Donal thought about it, the greater was his doubt whether he had spoken the truth. The man who could so make such a statement to his son concerning his mother must indeed have been capable of the wickedness assumed. But also the man who could make such a statement was surely vile enough to lie. The thing remained uncertain, and he was assuredly not called upon to act. But how would Forgue carry himself? His behaviour now would decide, or at least determine, his character. If he were indeed as honourable as he wished to be thought, he would tell Eppie what had occurred, and set himself at once to find some way of earning his and her bread, or at least to become capable of earning it. He did not seem to cherish any doubt of the truth of what had fallen in rage from his father's lips, for, to judge by his appearance to the few and brief glances Donal had of him during the next week or so, the iron had sunk into his soul. He looked more wretched than Donal could have believed it possible for man to be. Abject quite. It manifested very plainly what a miserable thing, how weak and weakening, is the pride of this world. One who could be so cast down was hardly one, alas, of whom to expect any greatness of action. He was not likely to have honesty or courage enough to decline a succession that was not his, even though it would leave his way clear to marry Eppie. Whether any of Forgue's misery arose from the fact that Donal had been present at the exposure of his position, Donal could not tell, but he could hardly fail to regard him as a dangerous holder of his secret, one who would be more than ready to take hostile action in the matter. At the same time, such had seemed the paralyzing influence of the shock upon him, that Donal doubted if he had been at any time during the interview so much aware of his presence as not to have forgotten it entirely before he came to himself. Had he remembered the fact, would he not have come to him to attempt securing his complicity? If he meant to do right, why did he hesitate? There was but one way, and that plain before him. But presently Donal began to see many things an equivocating demon might urge: the claims of his mother, the fact that there was no near heir, he did not even know who would come in his place, that he would do as well with the property as another, that he had been already grievously wronged, that his mother's memory would be yet more grievously wronged, that the marriage had been a marriage in the sight of God, and as such he surely of all men was in heaven's right to regard it, and his mother had been the truest of wives to his father. These things and more Donal saw he might plead with himself, and if he was the man he had given him no small ground to think, he would in all probability listen to them. He would recall or assume the existence of many precedents in the history of noble families. He would say that, knowing the general character of their heads, no one would believe a single noble family without at least one unrecorded, undiscovered, or well concealed irregularity in its descent, and he would judge it the cruelest thing to have let him know the blighting fact, seeing that in ignorance he might have succeeded with a good conscience. But what kind of a father was this, thought Donal, who would thus defile his son's conscience? He had not done it in mere revenge, but to gain his son's submission as well. Whether the poor fellow leaned to the noble or ignoble, it was no marvel he should wander about looking scarce worthy the name of man. If he would but come to him that he might help him! He could at least encourage him to refuse the evil and choose the good. But even if he would receive such help, the foregone passages between them rendered it sorely improbable it would ever fall to him to afford it. That his visits to Eppie were intermitted, Donal judged from her countenance and bearing, and if he hesitated to sacrifice his own pride to the truth, it could not be without contemplating as possible the sacrifice of her happiness to a lie. In such delay he could hardly be praying, "Lead me not into temptation." If not actively tempting himself, he was submitting to be tempted. He was lingering on the evil shore. Andrew Comyn stayed yet a week, slowly, gently fading out into life, darkening into eternal day, forgetting into knowledge itself. Donal was by his side when he went, but little was done or said. He crept into the open air in his sleep, to wake from the dreams of life, and the dreams of death, and the dreams of sleep all at once, and see them mingling together behind him like a broken wave, blending into one vanishing dream of a troubled, yet oh how precious night, past and gone. Once, about an hour before he went, Donal heard him murmur, "When I wake, I am still with thee." Doory was perfectly calm. When he gave his last sigh, she sighed too, said, "I winna be long, An'rew," and said no more. Eppie wept bitterly. Donal went every day to see them, till the funeral was over. It was surprising how many of the townsfolk attended it. Most of them had regarded the cobbler as a poor talkative enthusiast, with far more tongue than brains. Because they were so far behind and beneath him, they saw him very small. One cannot help reflecting what an indifferent trifle the funeral, whether plain to bareness, as in Scotland, or lovely with meaning, as often in England, is to the spirit who has but dropped his hurting shoes on the weary road, dropped all the dust and heat, dropped the road itself, yea, the world of his pilgrimage, which never was, never could be, never was meant to be his country, only the place of his sojourning, in which the stateliest house of marble can be but a tent, cannot be a house, yet less a home. Man could never be made at home here, save by a mutilation, a depression, a lessening of his being. Those who fancy it their home will come by growth one day to feel that it is no more their home than its mother's egg is the home of the lark. For some time Donal's savings continued to support the old woman and her granddaughter. But ere long Doory got so much to do in the way of knitting stockings and other things, and was set to so many light jobs by kindly people who respected her more than her husband, because they saw her less extraordinary, that she seldom troubled him. Miss Carmichael offered to do what she could to get Eppie a place, if she answered certain questions to her satisfaction. How she liked her catechizing I do not know, but she so far satisfied her interrogator that she did find her a place in Edinburgh. She wept sore at leaving Auchars, but there was no help. Rumour had been more cruel than untrue, and besides there was no peace for her near the castle. Not once had Lord Forgue sought her since he gave her up to Donal, and she thought he had then given her up altogether. Notwithstanding his kindness to her house, she all but hated Donal, perhaps the more nearly that her conscience told he had done nothing but what was right. Things returned into the old grooves at the castle, but the happy thought of his friend the cobbler, hammering and stitching in the town below, was gone from Donal. True, the craftsman was a nobleman now, but such he had always been. Forgue mooned about, doing nothing, and recognizing no possible help save in what was utter defeat. If he had had any faith in Donal, he might have had help fit to make a man of him, which he would have found something more than an earl. Donal would have taught him to look things in the face, and call them by their own names. It would have been the redemption of his being. To let things be as they truly are, and act with truth in respect of them, is to be a man. But Forgue showed little sign of manhood, present or to come. He was much on horseback, now riding furiously over everything, as if driven by the very fiend, now dawdling along with the reins on the neck of his weary animal. Donal once met him thus in a narrow lane. The moment Forgue saw him, he pulled up his horse's head, spurred him hard, and came on as if he did not see him. Donal shoved himself into the hedge, and escaped with a little mud. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant by George MacDonald. Chapter 50. A Southeasterly Wind. One morning, Donal in the schoolroom with Davy, a knock came to the door, and Lady Arctura entered. "The wind is blowing from the south-east," she said. "Listen then, my lady, whether you can hear anything," said Donal. "I fancy it is a very precise wind that is wanted." "I will listen," she answered, and went. The day passed, and he heard nothing more. He was at work in his room in the warm evening twilight, when Davy came running to his door, and said Archie was coming up after him. He rose and stood at the top of the stair to receive her. She had heard the music, she said, very soft. Would he go on the roof? "Where were you, my lady," asked Donal, "when you heard it? I have heard nothing up here." "In my own little parlour," she replied. "It was very faint, but I could not mistake it." They went upon the roof. The wind was soft and low, an excellent thing in winds. They knew the paths of the roof better now, and had plenty of light, although the moon, rising large and round, gave them little of hers yet, and were soon at the foot of the great chimney-stack, which grew like a tree out of the house. There they sat down to wait and hearken. "I am almost sorry to have made this discovery," said Donal. "Why?" asked Lady Arctura. "Should not the truth be found, whatever it may be? You at least think so." "Most certainly," answered Donal. "And if this be the truth, as I fully expect it will prove, then it is well it should be found to be. But I should have liked it better it had been something we could not explain." "I doubt if I understand you." Things that cannot be explained so widened the horizon around us, opened to us fresh regions for question and answer, for possibility and delight. They are so many kernels of knowledge closed in the hard nuts of seeming contradiction. You know, my lady, there are stories of certain houses being haunted by a mysterious music presaging evil to the family. I have heard of such music, but what can be the use of it? I do not know. I see not the smallest use in it. If it were of use, it would surely be more common. If it were of use, why should those who have it be of the class less favoured, so to speak, of the Lord of the universe, and the families of his poor never have it? Perhaps for the same reason that they have their other good things in this life, said Arctura. I am answered, confessed Donal, and have no more to say. These tales, if they require of us a belief in any special care over such houses, as if they were more precious in the eyes of God than the poorest cottage in the land, I cast them from me. But, said Arctura, in a deprecating tone, are not those houses which have more influence more important than the others? Surely, those which have more good influence. But such are rarely the great houses of a country. Our Lord was not an Asmonean prince, but the son of a humble maiden, his reputed father a working man. I do not see. I should like to understand how that has to do with it. You may be sure the Lord took the position in life in which it was most possible to do the highest good, and without driving the argument, for every work has its own specialty, it seems probable that the true ends of his coming will still be better furthered from the standpoint of humble circumstances than from that of rank and position. You always speak, said Arctura, as if there were only the things Jesus Christ came for to be cared about. Is there nothing but salvation worthy a human being's regard? If you give a true and large enough meaning to the word salvation, I answer you at once, nothing. Only in proportion as a man is saved will he do the work of the world aright, the whole design of which is to rear a beautiful, blessed family. The world is God's nursery for his upper rooms. Oneness with God is the end of the order of things. When that is attained, we shall do greater things than the Lord himself did on the earth. But was that not Aeolus? Listen. There came a low, prolonged wail. The ladder was in readiness. Donal set it up in haste, climbed to the cleft, and with a sheet of brown paper in his hands, waited the next cry of the prisoned chords. He was beginning to get tired of his position, when suddenly came a stronger puff, and he heard the music distinctly in the shaft beside him. It swelled and grew. He spread the sheet of paper over the opening, the wind blew it flat against the chimney, and the sound instantly ceased. He removed it, and again came the sound. The wind continued and grew stronger, so that they were able to make this simple experiment until no shadow of a doubt was left. They had discovered the source of the music. By certain dispositions of the paper they were even able to modify it. Donal descended, and said to Davy, "I wish you not to say a word about this to anyone, Davy, before Lady Arctura or I give you leave. You have a secret with us now. The castle belongs to Lady Arctura, and she has a right to ask you not to speak of it to anyone without her permission. I have a reason, my lady," he went on, turning to Arctura. "Will you please desire Davy to attend to what I say? I will immediately explain to you, but I do not want Davy to know my reason until you do. You can on the instant withdraw your prohibition, should you not think my reason a good one." "Davy," said Arctura, "I too have faith in Mr. Grant. I beg you will keep this all a secret for the present." "Oh, surely, cousin Archie," said Davy. "But, Mr. Grant, why should you make Archie speak to me too?" "Because the thing is her business, not mine. Run down and wait for me in my room. Go steadily over the bartizan, mind." Donal turned again to Arctura. "You know they say there is a hidden room in the castle, my lady?" "Do you believe it?" she returned. "I think there may be such a place." "Surely if there had been, it would have been found long ago." "They might have said that on the first report of the discovery of America." "That was far off, and across a great ocean." "And here are thick walls, and hearts careless and timid. Has anyone ever said in earnest about finding it?" "Not that I know of." "Then your objection falls to the ground. If you could have told me that one had tried to find the place, but without success, I would have admitted some force in it, though it would not have satisfied me without knowing the plans he had taken, and how they were carried out. On the other hand, it may have been known to many who held their peace about it. Would you not like to know the truth concerning that too?" "I should indeed. But would you not be sorry to lose another mystery?" On the contrary, there is only the rumour of a mystery now, and we do not quite believe it. We are not at liberty, in the name of good sense, to believe it yet, but if we find the room, or the space even where it may be, we shall probably find also a mystery, something never in this world to be accounted for, but suggesting 100 unsatisfactory explanations. But pardon me, I do not in the least presume to press it." Lady Arctura smiled. "You may do what you please," she said. "If I seemed for a moment to hesitate, it was only that I wondered what my uncle would say to it. I should not like to vex him." "Certainly not. But would he not be pleased?" "I will speak to him, and find out. He hates what he calls superstition, and I fancy has curiosity enough not to object to a search. I do not think he would consent to pulling down, but short of that I don't think he will mind. I should not wonder if he even joined in the search." Donal thought with himself it was strange then he had never undertaken one. Something told him the earl would not like the proposal. "But tell me, Mr. Grant, how would you set about it?" said Arctura, as they went towards the tower. "If the question were merely whether or not there was such a room, and not the finding of it—" "Excuse me, but how could you tell whether or not there was such a room except by searching for it?" "By determining whether there was or was not some space in the castle unaccounted for." "I do not see." "Would you mind coming to my room? It will be a lesson for Davy too." She assented, and Donal gave them a lesson in cubic measure and content. He showed them how to reckon the space that must lie within given boundaries. If then within those boundaries they could not find so much, part of it must be hidden. If they measured the walls of the castle, allowing of course for their thickness and every irregularity, and from that calculated the space they must hold, then measured all the rooms and open places within the walls, allowing for all partitions, and having again calculated found the space fall short of what they had from the outside measurements to expect, they must conclude either that they had measured or calculated wrong, or that there was space in the castle to which they had no access. "But," continued Donal, when they had in a degree mastered the idea, "if the thing was to discover the room itself, I should set about it in a different way. I should not care about the measuring. I would begin and go all over the castle, first getting the outside shape right in my head, and then fitting everything inside it into that shape of it in my brain. If I came to a part I could not so fit at once, I would examine that according to the rules I have given you, take exact measurements of the angles and sides of the different rooms and passages, and find whether these enclosed more space than I could at once discover inside them. But I need not follow the process farther. Pulling down might be the next thing, and we must not talk of that." "But the thing is worth doing, is it not, even if we do not go so far as to pull down?" "I think so." "And I think my uncle will not object. Say nothing about it, though, Davy, till we give you leave." That "we" was pleasant in Donal's ears. Lady Arctura rose, and they all went down together. When they reached the hall, Davy ran to get his kite. "But you have not told me why you would not have him speak of the music," said Arctura, stopping at the foot of the great stair. "Partly because, if we were to go on to make search for the room, it ought to be kept as quiet as possible, and the talk about the one would draw notice to the other, and partly because I have a hope that the one may even guide us to the other." "You will tell me about that afterwards," said Arctura, and went up the stair. That night the earl had another of his wandering fits. Also all night the wind blew from the south-east. In the morning Arctura went to him with her proposal. The instant he understood what she wished, his countenance grew black as thunder. "What!" he cried. "You would go pulling the grand old bulk to pieces for the sake of a foolish tale about the devil and a set of card-players? By my soul, I'll be damned if you do! Not while I'm above ground, at least! That's what comes of putting such a place in the power of a woman! It's sacrilege! By heaven, I'll throw my brother's will into chancery rather!" His rage was such as to compel her to think there must be more in it than appeared. The wilderness of the temper she had roused made her tremble, but it also woke the spirit of her race, and she repented of the courtesy she had shown him. She had the right to make what investigation she pleased. Her father would not have left her the property without good reasons for doing so, and of those reasons some might well have lain in the character of the man before her. Through all this rage the earl read something of what had sent the blood of the Graemes to her cheek and brow. "I beg your pardon, my love," he said, "but if he was your father, he was my brother." "He is my father," said Arctura coldly. "Dead and gone, and all but forgotten." "No, my lord, not for one day forgotten, not for one moment unloved." "Ah, well, as you please. But because you love his memory, must I regard him as a Solon? 'Tis surely no great treason to reflect upon the wisdom of a dead man." "I wish you good day, my lord," said Arctura, very angry, and left him. But when presently she found that she could not lift up her heart to her Father in heaven, gladly would she have sent her anger from her. Was it not plainly other than good when it came thus between her and the living God? All day at intervals she had to struggle and pray against it. A great part of the night she lay awake because of it. But at length she pitied her uncle too much to be very angry with him any more, and so fell asleep. In the morning she found that all sense of his having authority over her had vanished, and with it her anger. She saw also that it was quite time she took upon herself the duties of a landowner. What could Mr. Grant think of her, doing nothing for her people? But she could do little while her uncle received the rents and gave orders to Mr. Graham. She would take the thing into her own hands. In the meantime, Mr. Grant should, if he pleased, go on quietly with his examination of the house. But she could not get her interview with her uncle out of her head, and was haunted with vague suspicions of some dreadful secret about the house belonging to the present as well as the past. Her uncle seemed to have receded to a distance incalculable, and to have grown awful as he receded. She was of a nature almost too delicately impressionable. She not only felt things keenly, but retained the sting of them after the things were nearly forgotten. But then the swift and rare response of her faculties arose in no small measure from this impressionableness. At the same time, but for instincts and impulses derived from her race, her sensitiveness might have degenerated into weakness. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 51. A Dream. One evening, as Donal was walking in the little avenue below the terraces, Davy, who was now advanced to doing a little work without his master's immediate supervision, came running to him to say that Archie was in the schoolroom and wanted to see him. He hastened to her. "A word with you, please, Mr. Grant," she said. Donal sent the boy away. "I have debated with myself all day whether I should tell you," she began, and her voice trembled not a little. "But I think I shall not be so much afraid to go to bed if I do tell you what I dreamt last night." Her face was very pale, and there was a quiver about her mouth. She seemed ready to burst into tears. "Do tell me," said Donal sympathetically. "Do you think it very silly to mind one's dreams?" she asked. "Silly or not," answered Donal, "as regards the general run of dreams, it is plain you have had one that must be minded. What we must mind, it cannot be silly to mind." "I am in no mood, I fear, for philosophy," she rejoined, trying to smile. "It has taken such a hold of me that I cannot get rid of it, and there is no one I could tell it to but you. Anyone else would laugh at me, but you never laugh at anybody. I went to bed as well as usual, only a little troubled about my uncle's strangeness, and soon fell asleep to find myself presently in a most miserable place. It was like a brick-field, but a deserted brick-field. Heaps of broken and half-burnt bricks were all about. For miles and miles they stretched around me. I walked fast to get out of it. Nobody was near or in sight. There was not a sign of human habitation from horizon to horizon. All at once I saw before me a dreary church. It was old, tumble-down, and dirty, not in the least venerable, very ugly, a huge building without shape, like most of our churches. I shrank from the look of it. It was more horrible to me than I could account for. I feared it. But I must go in. Why, I did not know, but I must. The dream itself compelled me. I went in. It looked as if nobody had crossed its threshold for 100 years. The pews were mouldering away. The canopy over the pulpit had half fallen, and rested its edge on the book-board. The great galleries had in parts tumbled into the body of the church, In other parts they hung sloping from the walls. The centre of the floor had fallen in, and there was a great descending slope of earth, soft-looking, mixed with bits of broken and decayed wood, from the pews above and the coffins below. I stood gazing down in horror unutterable. How far the gulf went I could not see. I was fascinated by its slow depth, and the thought of its possible contents, when suddenly I knew, rather than perceived, that something was moving in its darkness. It was something dead, something yellow-white. It came nearer, it was slowly climbing, like one dead and stiff it was labouring up the slope. I could neither cry out nor move. It was about 3 yards below me when it raised its head. It was my uncle, dead and dressed for the grave. He beckoned me, and I knew I must go. I had to go, nor once thought of resisting. My heart became like lead, but immediately I began the descent. My feet sank in the mould of the ancient dead, soft as if thousands of graveyard moles were forever burrowing in it, as down and down I went, settling and sliding with the black plain. Then I began to see the sides and ends of coffins in the walls of the gulf, and the walls came closer and closer as I descended, until they scarcely left me room to get through. I comforted myself with the thought that those in these coffins had long been dead, and must by this time be at rest, nor was there any danger of seeing mouldy hands come out to seize me. At last I saw that my uncle had stopped, and I stood still, a few yards above him, more composed than I can understand. "The wonder is we are so believing, yet not more terrified in our dreams," said Donal. He began to heave and pull at a coffin that seemed to stop the way. Just as he got it dragged on one side, I saw on the bright silver handle of it the Morven crest. The same instant the lid rose, and my father came out of the coffin, looking alive and bright. My uncle stood beside him like a corpse beside a soul. "What do you want with my child?" he said, and my uncle cowered before him. He took my hand and said, "Come with me, my child," and I went with him. Oh, so gladly! My fear was gone, and so was my uncle. He led me up the way we had come down, but when we came out of the hole, instead of finding myself in the horrible church, I was in my own room. I looked round. No one was near. I was sorry my father was gone, but glad to be in my own room. Then I woke, and here was the terrible thing, not in my bed, but standing in the middle of the floor, just where my dream had left me. I cannot get rid of the thought that I really went somewhere. I have been haunted with it the whole day. It is a terror to me. For if I did, where is my help against going again?" "In God our Saviour," said Donal. "But had your uncle given you anything?" "I wish I could think so, but I do not see how he could." "You must change your room, and get Mistress Brookes to sleep near you." "I will." Gladly would Donal have offered to sleep, like one of his collies, outside her door, but Mrs. Brookes was the only one to help her. He began at once to make observations towards determining the existence or non-existence of a hidden room, but in the quietest way, so as to attract no attention, and had soon satisfied himself concerning some parts that it could not be there. Without free scope, and some one to help him, the thing was difficult. To gauge a building which had grown through centuries, to fit the varying tastes and changing needs of the generations, was in itself not easy, and he judged it all but impossible without drawing observation and rousing speculation. Great was the chaotic element in the congeries of erections and additions, brought together by various contrivances, and with daringly enforced communication. Open spaces within the walls, different heights in the stories of contiguous buildings, breaks in the continuity of floors, and various other irregularities he found confusingly obstructive. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 52. Investigation. The autumn brought terrible storms. Many fishing boats came to grief. Of some the crews lost everything. Of others, the loss of their lives delivered their crews from smaller losses. There were many bereaved in the village, and Donal went about among them, doing what he could, and getting help for them where his own ability would not reach their necessity. Lady Arctura wanted no persuasion to go with him in some of his visits, and the intercourse she thus gained with humanity in its simpler forms, of which she had not had enough for the health of her own nature, was of high service to her. Perhaps nothing helps so much to believe in the Father as the active practical love of the brother. If he who loveth not his own brother whom he hath seen can ill love God whom he hath not seen, then he who loves his brother must surely find it the easier to love God. Arctura found that to visit the widow and the fatherless in their afflictions, to look on and know them as her kind, to enter into their sorrows and share the elevating influence of grief genuine and simple, the same in every human soul, was to draw near to God. She met him in his children. For to honour, love, and be just to our neighbour is religion, and he who does these things will soon find that he cannot live without the higher part of religion, the love of God. If that do not follow, the other will sooner or later die away, leaving the man the worse for having had it. She found her way to God easier through the crowd of her fellows, while their troubles took her off her own, set them at a little distance from her, and so put it in her power to understand them better. One day after the fishing boats had gone out, rose a terrible storm. Some of them made for the harbour again, such as it was. Others kept out to sea. Stephen Kennedy's boat came ashore, bottom upward. His body was cast on the sands, close to the spot where Donal dragged the net from the waves. There was sorrow afresh through the village. Kennedy was a favourite, and his mother was left childless. No son would any more come sauntering in with his long slouch in the gloamin', and whether she would ever see him again, to know him, who could tell? For the common belief does not go much farther than paganism in yielding comfort to those whose living loves have disappeared, the fault not of Christianity, but of Christians. The effect of the news upon Forgue I have some ground for conjecturing. I believe it made him care a little less about marrying the girl, now that he knew no rival ready to take her, and feel also that he had one enemy the less, one danger the less in the path he would like to take. Within a week after, he left the castle, and if his father knew where he went, he was the only one who did. He had been pressing him to show some appearance of interest in his cousin. Forgue had professed himself unequal to the task at present. If he might go away for a while, he said, he would doubtless find it easier when he returned. The storms were over, the edges and hidden roots had begun to dream of spring, and Arctura had returned to her own room to sleep, when one afternoon she came to the schoolroom, and told Donal she had had the terrible dream again. "This time," she said, "I came out in my dream on the great stair, and went up to my room and into bed before I waked. But I dare not ask Mistress Brookes whether she saw me." "You do not imagine you were out of the room?" said Donal. "I cannot tell. I hope not. If I were to find I had been, it would drive me out of my senses. I was thinking all day about the lost room. I fancy it had something to do with that." "We must find the room and have done with it," said Donal. "Are you so sure we can?" she asked, her face brightening. "If there be one, and you will help me, I think we can," he answered. "I will help you." "Then first we will try the shaft of the music chimney. That it has never smoked, at least since those wires were put there, makes it something to question, though the draught across it might doubtless have prevented it from being used. It may be the chimney to the very room. But we will first try to find out whether it belongs to any room we know. I will get a weight and a cord. The wires will be a plague, but I think we can pass them. Then we shall see how far the weight goes down, and shall know on what floor it is arrested. That will be something gained. The plane of inquiry will be determined. Only there may be a turn in the chimney, preventing the weight from going to the bottom." "When shall we set about it?" said Arctura, almost eagerly. "At once," replied Donal. She went to get a shawl. Donal went to the gardener's tool-house, and found a suitable cord. There was a 7-pound weight, but that would not pass the wires. He remembered an old 8-day clock on a back stair, which was never going. He got out its heavier weight, and carried it with the cord and the ladder to his own stair, at the foot of which was Lady Arctura, waiting for him. There was that in being thus associated with the lovely lady, in knowing that peace had begun to visit her through him, that she trusted him implicitly, looking to him for help and even protection, in knowing that nothing but wrong to her could be looked for from uncle or cousin, and that he held what might be a means of protecting her, should undue influence be brought to bear upon her. There was that in all this, I say, that stirred to its depth the devotion of Donal's nature. With the help of God he would foil her enemies, and leave her a free woman, a thing well worth a man's life. Many an angel has been sent on a smaller errand. Such were his thoughts as he followed Arctura up the stair, she carrying the weight and the cord, he the ladder, which it was not easy to get round the screw of the stair. Arctura trembled with excitement as she ascended, grew frightened as often as she found she had outstripped him, waited till the end of the ladder came poking round, and started again before the bearer appeared. Her dreams had disquieted her more than she had yet confessed. Had she been taking a way of her own, and choosing a guide instead of receiving instruction in the way of understanding? Were these things sent to her for warning, to show her into what an abyss of death her conduct was leading her? But the moment she found herself in the open air of Donal's company, her doubts and fears vanished for the time. Such a one as he must surely know better than those others the way of the spirit. Was he not more childlike, more straightforward, more simple, and, she could not but think, more obedient than those? Mr. Carmichael was older, and might be more experienced, but did his light shine clearer than Donal's? He might be a priest in the temple, but was there not a Samuel in the temple as well as an Eli? It was the young, strong, ruddy shepherd, the defender of his flock, who was sent by God to kill the giant. He was too little to wear Saul's armour, but he could kill a man too big to wear it. Thus meditated Arctura as she climbed the stair, and her hope and courage grew. A delicate conscience, sensitive feelings, and keen faculties, subjected to the rough rasping of coarse, self-satisfied, unspiritual natures, had almost lost their equilibrium. As to natural condition, no one was sounder than she, yet even now, when she had more than begun to see its falsehood, a headache would suffice to bring her afresh under the influence of the hideous system she had been taught, and wake in her all kinds of deranging doubts and consciousnesses. Subjugated so long to the untrue, she required to be for a time, until her spiritual being should be somewhat individualized, under the genial influences of one who was not afraid to believe, one who knew the Master. Nor was there danger to either, so long as he sought no end of his own, so long as he desired only his will, so long as he could say, "Whom is there in heaven but thee? And there is none upon earth that I desire besides thee." By the time she reached the top, she was radiantly joyous in the prospect of a quiet hour with him whose presence and words always gave her strength, who made the world look less mournful, and the will of God altogether beautiful, who taught her that the glory of the Father's love lay in the inexorability of its demands, that it is of his deep mercy that no one can get out until he has paid the uttermost farthing. They stepped upon the roof, and into the gorgeous afterglow of an autumn sunset. The whole country, like another sea, was flowing from that well of colour, in tidal waves of an ever-advancing creation. Its more ethereal part, rushing on above, broke on the old roofs and chimneys, and splashed its many-tinted foam all over them, while through it, enfolded in it, came a cold, thin wind that told of coming death. Arctura breathed a deep breath, and her joy grew. It is wonderful how small a physical elevation, lifting us into a slightly thinner air, serves to raise the human spirits. We are like barometers, only work the other way. The higher we go, the higher goes our mercury. They stood for a moment in deep enjoyment, then simultaneously turned to each other. "My lady," said Donal, "with such a sky as that out there, it hardly seems as if there could be such a thing as our search to-night. Hollow places, hidden away for evil cause, do not go with it at all. There is the story of gracious invention and glorious gift, here the story of greedy gathering and self-seeking, which all concealment involves." "But there may be nothing, you know, Mr. Grant," said Arctura, troubled for the house. "There may be nothing, but if there is such a room, you may be sure it has some relation with terrible wrong. What, we may never find out, or even the traces of it." "I shall not be afraid," she said, as if speaking with herself. "It is the terrible dreaming that makes me weak. In the morning I tremble as if I had been in the hands of some evil power." Donal turned his eyes upon her. How thin she looked in the last of the sunlight! A pang went through him at the thought that one day he might be alone with Davy in the huge castle, untended by the consciousness that a living light and loveliness flitted somewhere about its gloomy and ungenial walls. But he would not think the thought. How that dismal Miss Carmichael must have worried her! When the very hope of the creature in his Creator is attacked in the name of religion, when his longing after a living God is met with the offer of a paltry escape from hell, how is the creature to live? It is God we want, not heaven; his righteousness, not an imputed one for our own possession; remission, not letting off; love, not endurance for the sake of another, even if that other be the one loveliest of all. They turned from the sunset and made their way to the chimney stack. There once more Donal set up his ladder. He tied the clock weight to the end of his cord, dropped it in, and with a little management got it through the wires. It went down and down, gently lowered, till the cord was all out, and still it would go. "Do run and get some more," said Arctura. "You do not mind being left alone?" "No, if you will not be long." "I will run," he said, and run he did, for she had scarcely begun to feel the loneliness when he returned panting. He took the end she had been holding, tied on the fresh cord he had brought, and again lowered away. As he was beginning to fear that after all he had not brought enough, the weight stopped, resting, and drew no more. "If only we had eyes in that weight," said Arctura, "like the snails at the end of their horns." "We might have greased the bottom of the weight," said Donal, "as they do the lead when they want to know what kind of bottom there is to the sea. It might have brought up ashes. If it will not go any farther, I will mark the string at the mouth and draw it up." He moved the weight up and down a little. It rested still, and he drew it up. "Now we must mark off it the height of the chimney above the parapet wall," he said, "and then I will lower the weight towards the court below, until this last knot comes to the wall. The weight will then show us on the outside how far down the house it went inside." "Ah, I thought so," he went on, looking over after the weight. "Only to the first floor, or thereabouts. No, I think it is lower. But anyhow, my lady, as you can see, the place with which the chimney, if chimney it be, communicates, must be somewhere about the middle of the house, and perhaps is on the first floor. We can't judge very well looking down from here, and against a spot where there are no windows. Can you imagine what place it might be?" "I cannot," answered Arctura, "but I could go into every room on that floor without anyone seeing me." "Then I will let the weight down the chimney again, and leave it for you to see, if you can, below. If you find it, we must do something else." It was done, and they descended together. Donal went back to the schoolroom, not expecting to see her again till the next day. But in half an hour she came to him, saying she had been into every room on that floor, both where she thought it might be, and where she knew it could not be, and had not seen the weight. "The probability then is," replied Donal, "that thereabouts somewhere, there or farther down in that neighbourhood, lies the secret. But we cannot be sure, for the weight may not have reached the bottom of the shaft. Let us think what we shall do next." He placed a chair for her by the fire. They had the room to themselves. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 53. Mistress Brookes upon the Earl. They were hardly seated when Simmons appeared, saying he had been looking everywhere for her ladyship, for his lordship was taken as he had never seen him before. He had fainted right out in the half-way room, and he could not get him to. Having given orders to send at once to Auchars for the doctor, Lady Arctura hastened with Donal to the room on the stair. The earl was stretched motionless and pale on the floor. But for a slight twitching in one muscle of the face, they might have concluded him dead. They tried to get something down his throat, but without success. The men carried him up to his chamber. He began to come to himself, and Lady Arctura left him, telling Simmons to come to the library when he could, and let them know how he was. In about an hour he came. The doctor had been, and his master was better. "Do you know any cause for the attack?" asked her ladyship. "I'll tell you all about it, my lady, so far as I know," answered the butler. "I was there in that room with him. I had taken him some accounts, and was answering some questions about them, when all at once there came a curious noise in the wall. I can't think what it was. An inward rumbling it was, that seemed to go up and down the wall with a sort of groaning, then stopped a while and came again. It sounded nothing very dreadful to me. Perhaps if it had been in the middle of the night I mightn't have liked it. His lordship started at the first sound of it, turned pale and gasped, then cried out, laid his hand on his heart, and rolled off his chair. I did what I could for him, but it wasn't like one of his ordinary attacks, and so I came to your ladyship. He's such a ticklish subject, you see, my lady. It's quite alarming to be left alone with him. It's his heart. And you know, my lady, I should be sorry to frighten you, but you know, Mr. Grant, a gentleman with that complaint may go off any moment. I must go back to him now, my lady, if you please." Arctura turned and looked at Donal. "We must be careful," he said. "We must," she answered. "Just thereabout is one of the few places in the house where you hear the music. And thereabout the music chimney goes down. That is settled. But why should my lord be frightened so?" "I cannot tell. He is not like other people, you know." "Where else is the music heard? You and your uncle seem to hear it oftener than anyone else." "In my own room. But we will talk to-morrow. Good night." "I will remain here the rest of the evening," said Donal, "in case Simmons might want me to help with his lordship." It was well into the night, and he still sat reading in the library, when Mrs. Brookes came to him. She had had to get his lordship what he called a cat, something or other, that was nothing but mustard to the soles of his feet to draw away the blood. "He's better than all," she said. "He's ta'en a dose o' one of the drugs he's aye potterin' with. Fain to learn the trade o' living for ever, I reckon. But that's a thing the Lord has keepit in his ain hands. The tree o' life was never aten of, and never will be now in this world. It's long transplanted. But as to living for ever, or I would be his lordship, I would give up the ghost at once." "What makes you say that, Mistress Brookes?" asked Donal. "It's no ilk ane I would answer sic a question till," she replied, "but I'm weel assured ye hae sense and heart enough both, not to hurt a creature. And I'll just gang so far as to say to yoursel', and atween the two of us, 'at I hae heard from them 'at's away, them 'at weel kent, being about the place and trusted, that when the fit was upon him, he was fell cruel to the bonny wife he married abroad and brought home with him, till a cold-hearted country, poor thing, she maun have thought it." "How could he have been cruel to her in the house of his brother? Even if he was the wretch to be guilty of it, his brother would never have connived at the ill treatment of any woman under his roof." "Hoo ken ye the old yerl so weel?" asked Mrs. Brookes with a sly glance. "I ken," answered Donal, direct as was his wont, but finding somehow a little shelter in the dialect. "'At sic a daughter could ill ha' been born to any but a man that, well, 'at would at least behave till a woman like a man." "Ye're in the right. He was the tenderest hearted man. But he was far frae stout, and was a heap by himsel', nearhan as muckle as his lordship the present yerl. And the lady was that proud, and that devoted to the man she called her ain, that never a word o' what gaed on came to the ears of his brother, I dare to say, or I should warran ye there would have been a fine steer. It came, she said, my old auntie said, o' some kind of a madness they hadna a name for yet. I think mysel' there is a madness o' the heart as well as o' the head, and in that madness men take their woman for a property o' their ain, to be handled any gait the deevil puts into them. Cries in the deid o' the night, and never a shaw in the morning but white cheeks and red een, tells its ain tale. In the end the poor lady died. It might hae lived but for him, and her bairnie died afore her, and the wrongs o' bairns and women stick long to the walls o' the universe. It was said she came efter him again. I kenna, but I have seen and heard in this house what I shall hold my tongue about. Sure I am he wasna a good man to the poor woman. When it comes to that, Maister Grant, it's no my lady and them, but we're all women thegither. She died not in this house, I understand, but in the house down in the town, though that's neither here nor there. I wouldna wonder but the conscience might be woken up intil him. Some day it maun wake up. He'll be sorry, maybe, when he kens himsel' upon the border where a speck o' persons is o'er, and a woman's as good as a man, maybe a wheen better. The Lord'll set all thing right, or han it o'er till another. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 54. Lady Arctura's Room. The next day, when he saw Lady Arctura, Donal was glad to learn that, for all the excitement of the day before, she had passed a good night, and never dreamed at all. "I've been thinking it all over, my lady," he said, "and it seems to me that, if your uncle heard the noise of our plummet so near, the chimney can hardly rise from the floor you searched, for that room, you know, is half-way between the ground floor and first floor. Still, sound does travel so. We must betake ourselves to measurement, I fear. But another thing came into my head last night, which may serve to give us a sort of parallax. You said you heard the music in your own room. Would you let me look about in it a little? Something might suggest itself. Is it the room I saw you in once?" "Not that," answered Arctura, "but the bedroom beyond it. I hear it sometimes in either room, but louder in the bedroom. You can examine it when you please. If only you could find my bad dream and drive it out! Will you come now?" "It is near the earl's room. Is there no danger of his hearing anything?" "Not the least. The room is not far from his, it is true, but it is not in the same block. There are thick walls between. Besides, he is too ill to be up." She led the way, and Donal followed her up the main staircase to the second floor, and into the small, curious, ancient room, evidently one of the oldest in the castle, which she had chosen for her sitting room. Perhaps if she had lived less in the shadow, she might have chosen a less gloomy one. The sky was visible only through a little lane of walls and gables and battlements. But it was very charming, with its odd nooks and corners, recesses and projections. It looked an afterthought, the utilization of a space accidentally defined by rejection, as if every one of its sides were the wall of a distinct building. "I do wish, my lady," said Donal, "you would not sit so much where there is so little sunlight. Outer and inner things are in their origin one. The light of the sun is the natural world clothing of the truth, and whoever sits much in the physical dark misses a great help to understanding the things of the light. If I were your director," he went on, "I would counsel you to change this room for one with a broad, fair outlook, so that, when gloomy thoughts hid God from you, they might have his eternal contradiction in the face of his heaven and earth." "It is but fair to tell you," replied Arctura, "that Sophia would have had me do so. But while I felt about God as she taught me, what could the fairest sunlight be to me?" "Yes, what indeed?" returned Donal. "Do you know," he added presently, his eyes straying about the room, "I feel almost as if I were trying to understand a human creature. A house is so like a human mind, which gradually disentangles and explains itself as you go on to know it. It is no accidental resemblance, for as an unavoidable necessity, every house must be like those that built it." "But in a very old house," said Arctura, "so many hands of so many generations have been employed in the building, and so many fancied as well as real necessities have been at work, that it must be a conflict of many natures. But where the house continues in the same family, the builders have more or less transmitted their nature, as well as their house, to those who come after them." "Do you think then," said Arctura, almost with a shudder, "that I inherit a nature like the house left me? That the house is an outside to me, fits my very self as the shell fits the snail?" "The relation of outer and inner is there, but there is given with it an infinite power to modify. Every one is born nearer to God than to any ancestor, and it rests with him to cultivate either the godness or the selfness in him, his original or his mere ancestral nature. The fight between the natural and the spiritual man is the history of the world. The man who sets his faults inherited makes atonement for the sins of those who went before him. He is baptized for the dead, not with water, but with fire." "That seems to me strange doctrine," said Arctura, with tremulous objection. "If you do not like it, do not believe it. We inherit from our ancestors vices no more than virtues, but tendencies to both. Vice in my great great grandfather may in me be an impulse." "How horrible!" cried Arctura. "To say that we inherit sin from Adam horrifies nobody. The source is so far back from us that we let the stream fill our cisterns unheeded. But to say we inherit it from this or that nearer ancestor causes the fact to assume its definite and individual reality, and make a correspondent impression." "Then you allow that it is horrible to think oneself under the influence of the vices of certain wicked people through whom we come where we are?" "I would allow it, were it not that God is nearer to us than any vices, even were they our own. He is between us and those vices. But in us they are not vices, only possibilities, which become vices when they are yielded to." Then there are at the same time all sorts of counteracting and redeeming influences. It may be that wherein a certain ancestor was most wicked, his wife was especially lovely. He may have been cruel, and she tender as the hen that gathers her chickens under her wing. The main danger is, perhaps, of being caught in some sudden gust of unsuspected impulse, and carried away of the one tendency before the other has time to assert and the will to rouse itself. But those who doubt themselves and try to do right may hope for warning. Such will not, I think, be allowed to go far out of the way for want of that. Self-confidence is the worst traitor. You comfort me a little. And then you must remember, continued Donal, that nothing in its immediate root is evil, that from best human roots worse things spring. No one, for instance, will be so full of indignation, of fierceness, of revenge, as the selfish man born with a strong sense of justice. But you say this is not the room in which you hear the music best? No, it is here. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 55. Her Bedchamber. Lady Arctura opened the door of her bedroom. Donal glanced round it. It was as old-fashioned as the other. "What is behind that press there? Wardrobe, I think you call it," he asked. "Only a recess," answered Lady Arctura. "The press, I am sorry to say, is too high to get into it." Possibly, had the press stood in the recess, the latter would have suggested nothing. But having caught sight of the opening behind the press, Donal was attracted by it. It was in the same wall with the fireplace, but did not seem formed by the projection of the chimney, for it did not go to the ceiling. "Would you mind if I moved the wardrobe a little on one side?" he asked. "Do what you like," she answered. Donal moved it, and found the recess rather deep for its size. The walls of the room were wainscoted to the height of 4 feet or so, but the recess was bare. There were signs of hinges on one, and of a bolt on the other of the front edges. It had seemingly been once a closet, whose door continued the wainscot. There were no signs of shelves in it. The plaster was smooth. But Donal was not satisfied. He took a big knife from his pocket, and began tapping all round. The moment he came to the right-hand side, there was a change in the sound. "You don't mind if I make a little dust, my lady?" he said. "Do anything you please," answered Arctura. He sought in several places to drive the point of his knife into the plaster. It would nowhere enter it more than 1/4 of an inch. Here was no built wall, he believed, but one smooth stone. He found nothing like a joint till he came near the edge of the recess. There was a limit of the stone, and he began at once to clear it. It gave him a straight line from the bottom to the top of the recess, where it met another at right angles. "There does seem, my lady," he said, "to be some kind of closing up here, though it may of course turn out of no interest to us. Shall I go on, and see what it is?" "By all means," she answered, but turned pale as she spoke. Donal looked at her anxiously. She understood his look. "You must not mind my feeling a little silly," she said. "I am not silly enough to give way to it." He went on again with his knife, and had presently cleared the outlines of a stone that filled nearly all the side of the recess. He paused. Go on, said Arctura. "I must first get a better tool or two," answered Donal. "Will you mind being left?" "I can bear it, but do not be long. A few minutes may evaporate my courage." Donal hurried away to get a hammer and chisel, and a pail to put the broken plaster in. Lady Arctura stood and waited. The silence closed in upon her. She began to feel eerie. She felt as if she had but to will and see through the wall to what lay beyond it. To keep herself from so willing, she had all but reduced herself to mental inaction, when she started to her feet with a smothered cry. A knock not over gentle sounded on the door of the outer room. She darted to the bedroom door and flung it to, next the press, and with one push had it nearly in its place. Then she opened again the door, thinking to wait for a second knock on the other before she answered. But as she opened the inner, the outer door also opened, slowly, and a face looked in. She would rather have had a visitor from behind the press. It was her uncle, his face cadaverous, his eyes dull but with a kind of glitter in them, his look like that of a housebreaker. In terror of himself, in terror lest he should discover what they had been about, in terror lest Donal should appear wishing to warn the latter, and certain that, early as it was, her uncle was not himself, with intuitive impulse, the moment she saw him, she cried out, "Uncle, what is that behind you?" She felt afterwards, and was very sorry, that it was both a deceitful and cruel thing to do, but she did it, as I have said, by a swift, unreflecting instinct, which she concluded, in thinking about it, came from the ready craft of some ancestor, and illustrated what Donal had been saying. The earl turned, like one struck on the back, imagined something of which Arctura knew nothing, cowered to 2/3 of his height, and crept away. Though herself trembling from head to foot, Arctura was seized with such a pity that she followed him to his room, but she dared not go in. She stood a moment in the passage within sight of his door, and thought she heard his bell ring. Now Simmons might meet Donal. In a moment or two, however, she was relieved. Donal came round a turn, carrying his implements. She signed to him to make haste, and he was just safe inside her room, when Simmons came along on his way to his master's. She drew the door to, as if she had been just coming out, and said, "Knock at my door as you return, and tell me how your master is. I heard his bell." She then begged Donal to go on with his work, but stop it the moment she made a noise with the handle of the door, and resumed her place outside till Simmons should reappear. Full 10 minutes she stood waiting. It seemed an hour. Though she heard Donal at work within, and knew Simmons must soon come, though the room behind her was her own, and familiar to her from childhood, the long empty passage in front of her appeared frightful. What might not come pacing along towards her? At last she heard her uncle's door, steps, and the butler approached. She shook the handle of the door, and Donal's blows ceased. "I can't make him out, my lady," said Simmons. "It is nothing very bad, I think, this time, but he gets worse and worse, always taking more and more of them horrid drugs. It's no use trying to hide it. He'll drop off sudden one of these days. I've heard say laudanum don't shorten life, but it's not 1 nor 2 nor half a dozen sorts of laudanums he keeps mixing in that poor inside of his. The end must come, and what will it be? It's better you should be prepared for it when it do come, my lady. I've just been a giving of him some into his skin, with a little sharp-pointed thing, a syringe, you know, my lady. He says it's the only way to take some medicines. He's just a slave to his medicines, my lady." As soon as he was gone, Arctura returned to Donal. He had knocked the plaster away, and uncovered a slab, very like one of the great stones on some of the roofs. The next thing was to prise it from the mortar, and that was not difficult. The instant he drew the stone away, a dank chill assailed them, accompanied by a humid smell, as from a long-closed cellar. They stood and looked, now at each other, now at the opening in the wall, where was nothing but darkness. The room grew cold and colder. Donal was anxious as to how Arctura might stand what discovery lay before them, and she was anxious to read his sensations. For her sake, he tried to hide all expression of the awe that was creeping over him, and it gave him enough to do. "We are not far from something, my lady," he said. "It makes one think of what he said who carries the light everywhere, that there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, neither hid that shall not be known. Shall we leave it for the present?" "Anything but that," said Arctura with a shiver. "Anything but an unknown, terrible something. But what can you do with it?" "Let the daylight in upon it." Her colour returned as she spoke, and a look of determination came into her eyes. "You will not be afraid to be left then when I go down?" "I am cowardly enough to be afraid, but not cowardly enough to let you go alone. I will share with you. I shall not be afraid, not much, not too much, I mean, if I am with you." Donal hesitated. "See," she went on, "I am going to light a candle, and ask you to come down with me. If down it be, it may be up." "I am ready, my lady," said Donal. She lighted the candle. "Had we not better lock the door, my lady?" "That might set them wondering," she answered. "We should have to lock both the doors of this room, or else both the passage doors. The better way will be to pull the press after us when we are behind it." "You are right, my lady. Please take some matches with you." "To be sure." "You will carry the candle, please. I must have my hands free." Try to let the light shine past me as much as you can, that I may see where I am going, but I shall depend most on my hands and feet." End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 56. The Lost Room. Donal then took the light from her hand, and looked in. The opening went into the further wall, and turned immediately to the left. He gave her back the candle, and went in. Arctura followed close. There was a stair in the thickness of the wall, going down steep and straight. It was not wide enough to let them go abreast. "Put your hand on my shoulder, my lady," said Donal. "That will keep us together. If I fall, you must stand stock still." She put her hand on his shoulder, and they began their descent. The steps were narrow and high, therefore the stair was steep. They had gone down from 30 to 35 steps, when they came to a level passage, turning again at right angles to the left. It was twice the width of the stair. Its sides, like those of the stair, were of roughly dressed stones, and unplastered. It led them straight to a strong door. It was locked, and in the rusty lock they could see the key from within. To the right was another door, a smaller one which stood wide open. They went through, and by a short passage entered an opener space. Here on one side there seemed to be no wall, and they stood for a moment afraid to move lest they should tumble into darkness. But sending the light about, and feeling with hands and feet, they soon came to an idea of the place they were in. It was a little gallery, with arches on one side opening into a larger place, the character of which they could only conjecture, for nearly all they could determine was, that it went below and rose above where they stood. On the other side was a plain wall, such as they had had on both sides of them. They had been speaking in awe-filled whispers, and were now in silence, endeavouring to send their sight through the darkness beyond the arches. "Listen, my lady," said Donal. From above their heads came a chord of the aerial music, soft and faint and wild. A strange effect it had. It was like news of the still airy night and the keen stars, come down through secret ways into the dark places of the earth, from spaces so wide that they seemed the most awful of prisons. It sweetly fostered Arctura's courage. "That must be how the songs of angels sounded with news of high heaven to the people of old," she said. Donal was not in so high a mood. He was occupied at the moment with the material side of things. "We can't be far," he said, "from the place where our plummet came down. But let us try a little further." The next moment they came against a cord, and at their feet was the weight of the clock. At the other end of the little gallery they came again to a door, and again to a stair, turning to the right, and again they went down. Arctura kept up bravely. The air was not so bad as might have been feared, though it was cold and damp. This time they descended but a little way, and came to a landing place, on the right of which was a door. Donal raised a rusty latch, and pushed. The door swung open against the wall, dropping from one hinge with the slight shock. 2 steps more they descended, and stood on a stone floor. Donal thought at first they must be in one of the dungeons, but soon bethought himself that they had not descended far enough for that. A halo of damp surrounded their candle. Its weak light seemed scarcely to spread beyond it. For some moments they took in nothing of what was around them. The floor first began to reveal itself to Donal's eye. In the circle of the light he saw, covered with dust as it was, its squares of black and white marble. Then came to him a gleam of white from the wall. It was a tablet, and at the other end was something like an altar or a tomb. "We are in the old chapel of the castle," he said. "But what is that?" he added instantly, with an involuntary change of voice, and a shudder through his whole nervous being. Arctura turned. Her hand sought his and clasped it convulsively. They stood close to something which the light itself had concealed from them. Ere they were conscious of an idea concerning it, each felt the muscles of neck and face drawn, as if another power than their own invaded their persons. but they were live wills and would not be overcome. They forced their gaze, perception cleared itself, and slowly they saw and understood. With strangest dream-like incongruity and unfitness, the thing beside them was a dark bedstead, with carved posts and low wooden tester, richly carved. This in the middle of a chapel. But there was no speculation in them. They could only see, not think. Donal took the candle. From the tester hung large pieces of stuff that had once made heavy curtains, but seemed hardly now to have as much cohesion as the dust on a cobweb. It held together only in virtue of the lightness to which decay had reduced it. On the bed lay a dark mass, like bedclothes and bedding not quite turned to dust. They could yet see something like embroidery in one or two places, dark like burnt paper, or half-burnt flaky rags, horrid as a dream of dead love. Heavens! What was that shape in the middle? What was that on the black pillow? What was that thick line stretching towards one of the head-posts? They stared speechless. Arctura pressed close to Donal. His arm went round her to protect her from what threatened almost to overwhelm himself, the inroad of an unearthly horror. Plain to the eyes of both, the form in the middle of the bed was that of a human body, slowly crumbling where it lay. Bed and blankets and quilt, sheets and pillows had crumbled with it through the long wasting years, but something of its old shape yet lingered with the dust. That was a head that lay on the pillow. That was the line of a long arm that pointed across the pillow to the post. What was that hanging from the bedpost and meeting the arm? God in heaven! There was a staple in the post, and from the staple came a chain, and there at its other end a ring, lying on the pillow, and through it, yes, through it, the dust arm passed. This was no mere death-bed. It was a torture-bed, most likely a murder-bed, and on it yet lay the body that died on it. Had lain for hundreds of years, unlifted for kindly burial. The place of its decease had been made its tomb, closed up and hidden away. A bed in a chapel, and one dead thereon. How could it be? Had the woman, for Donal imagined the form yet showed it the body of a woman, been carried thither of her own desire, to die in a holy place? That could not be. There was the chain. Had she sought refuge there from some persecutor? If so, he had found her. She was a captive, mad perhaps, more likely hated and the victim of a terrible revenge, left probably enough to die of hunger or disease, neglected or tended, who could tell? One thing only was clear, that there she died, and there she was buried. Arctura was trembling. Donal drew her closer, and would have taken her away. But she said in his ear, as if in dread of disturbing the dust, "I am not frightened, not very. It is only the cold, I think." They went softly to the other end of the chapel, almost clinging together as they went. They saw 3 narrow lancet windows on their right, but no glimmer came through them. They came to what had seemed an altar, and such it still seemed, but on its marble top lay the dust plainly of an infant, sight sad as fearful, and full of agonizing suggestion. They turned away, nor either looked at the other. The awful silence of the place seemed settling on them like a weight. Donal made haste, nor did Arctura seem less anxious to leave it. When they reached the stair he made her go first. He must be between her and the terror. As they passed the door on the other side of the little gallery, down whose spiracle had come no second breath, Donal said to himself he must question that door, but to Arctura he said nothing. She had had enough of inquiry for the moment. Slowly they ascended to Arctura's chamber. Donal replaced the slab, and propped it in its position, gathered the plaster into the pail, replaced the press, and put a screw through the bottom of it into the floor. Arctura stood and watched him all the time. "You must leave your room again, my lady," said Donal. "I will. I shall speak to Mistress Brookes at once." "Will you tell her all about it?" "We must talk about that." "How will she bear it?" thought Donal. "How after such an experience can she spend the rest of the day alone? There is all the long afternoon and evening to be met." He gave the last turn to the screw in the floor, and rose. Then first he saw that Arctura had turned very white. "Do sit down, my lady," he said. "I would run for Mistress Brookes, but I dare not leave you." "No, No, we will go down together. Give me that bottle of eau de cologne, please." Donal did not know either eau de cologne or its bottle, but he darted to the dressing table and guessed correctly. It revived her, and she began to take deep breaths. Then with a strong effort she rose to go down. The time for speech concerning what they had seen was not come. "Would you not like, my lady," said Donal, "to come to the schoolroom this afternoon? You could sit beside while I give Davy his lessons." "Yes," she answered at once, "I should like it much. Is there not something you could give me to do? Will you not teach me something?" "I should like to begin you with Greek, and teach you a little mathematics. Geometry first of all." "You frighten me." "Your fright wouldn't outlast the beginning," said Donal. "Anyhow, you will have Davy and me for company. You must be lonely sometimes. You see little of Miss Carmichael now, I fancy." "She has not been near me since that day in the avenue. We salute now and then, coming out of church. She will not come again except I ask her, and I shall be in no haste. She would only assume I was sorry, and could not do without her." "I should let her wait, my lady," said Donal. "She sorely wants humbling." "You do not know her, Mr. Grant, if you think anything I could do would have that effect on her." "Pardon me, my lady. I did not imagine it your task to humble her. But you need not let her ride over you as she used to do. She knows nothing really, and a great many things unreally. Unreal knowledge is worse than ignorance. Would not Miss Graeme be a better friend?" "She is much more lovable, but she does not trouble her head about the things I care for. I mean religion," she added hesitatingly. "So much the better." "Mr. Grant!" "You did not let me finish, my lady. So much the better, I was going to say, till she begins to trouble her heart about it, or rather to untrouble her heart with it. The Pharisee troubled his head, and no doubt his conscience too, and did not go away justified. But the poor publican, as we with our stupid pity would call him, troubled his heart about it, and that trouble once set a-going, there is no fear. Head and all must soon follow. But how am I to get rid of this plaster without being seen?" "I will show you the way to your own stair without going down. The way we came once, you may remember. You can take it to the top of the house till it is dark. But I do not feel comfortable about my uncle's visit. Can it be that he suspects something? Perhaps he knows all about the chapel, and that stair too." "He is a man to enjoy having a secret. But our discovery bears out what we were saying as to the likeness of house and man, does it not?" "You don't mean there is anything like that in me?" rejoined Arctura, looking frightened. "You!" he exclaimed. "But I mean no individual application," he added, "except as reflected from the general truth. This house is like every human soul, and so like me and you and all of us. We have found the chapel of the house, the place they used to pray to God in, built up, lost, forgotten, filled with dust and damp, and the mouldering dead lying there before the Lord, waiting to be made live again and praise him." "I said you meant me," murmured Arctura, with a faint, sad smile. "No, the time is past for that. It is long since first you were aware of the dead self in the lost chapel. A hungry soul soon misses both, and knows without being sure of it that they are somewhere. You have kept searching for them in spite of all persuasion that the quest was foolish." Arctura's eyes shone in her pale face, but they shone with gathering tears. Donal turned away, and took up the pail. She rose and guided him to his tower stair, where he went up and she went down. End of chapter 56. Chapter 57 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devora Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 57. The Housekeeper's Room. As the clock upon the schoolroom chimney-piece struck the hour, Arctura entered, and at once took her seat at the table with Davy, much to the boy's wonder and pleasure. Donal gave her a Euclid, and set her a task. She began at once to learn it, and after a while so brief that Davy stared incredulous, said, "If you please, Mr. Grant, I think I could be questioned upon it now." Less than a minute sufficed to show Donal that she thoroughly understood what she had been learning, and he set her then a little more. By the time their work was over, he had not a doubt left that such like intellectual occupation would greatly subserve all phases of her health. With entireness she gave herself to the thing she had to do, and Donal thought how strong must be her nature to work so calmly, and think so clearly after what she had gone through that morning. School over, and Davy gone to his rabbits. "Mistress Brookes invites us to supper with her," said Lady Arctura. "I asked her to ask us. I don't want to go to bed till I am quite sleepy. You don't mind, do you?" "I am very glad, my lady," responded Donal. "Don't you think we had better tell her all about it?" "As you think fit. The secret is in no sense mine. It is only yours, and the sooner it ceases to be a secret, the better for all of us." "I have but one reason for keeping it," she returned. "Your uncle?" "Yes. I know he will be annoyed, but there may be other reasons why I should reveal the thing." "There may indeed," said Donal. "Still I should be sorry to offend him more than I cannot help. If he were a man like my father, I should never dream of going against him. I should in fact leave everything to him he cared to attend to. But seeing he is the man he is, it would be absurd. I dare not let him manage my affairs for me much longer. I must understand for myself how things are going." "You will not, I hope, arrange anything without the presence of a lawyer. I fear I have less confidence in your uncle than you have." Arctura made no reply, and Donal was afraid he had hurt her. But the next moment she looked up with a sad smile, and said, "Well, poor man, we will not compare our opinions of him. He is my father's brother, and I shall be glad not to offend him. But my father would have reason to be dissatisfied if I left everything to my uncle as if he had not left everything to me. If he had been another sort of man, my father would surely have left the estate to him." At 9 o'clock they met in the housekeeper's room, low ceilinged, large, lined almost round with oak presses, which were Mistress Brookes's delight. She welcomed them as to her own house, and made an excellent hostess. But Donal would not mix the tumbler of toddy she would have had him take. For one thing, he did not like his higher to be operated upon from his lower. It made him feel as if possessed by a not altogether real self. But the root of his objection lay in the teaching of his mother. The things he had learned of his parents were to him his patent of nobility, vouchers that he was honourably descended. Of his birth he was as proud as any man. And hence this night he was led to talk of his father and mother, and the things of his childhood. He told Arctura all about the life he had led, how at one time he kept cattle in the fields, at another sheep on the mountains; how it came that he was sent to college, and all the story of Sir Gibbie. The night wore on. Arctura listened, did nothing but listen. She was enchanted. And it surprised Donal himself to find how calmly he could now look back upon what had seemed to threaten an everlasting winter of the soul. It was indeed the better thing that Ginevra should be Gibbie's wife. A pause had come, and he had fallen into a brooding memory of things gone by, when a sudden succession of quick knocks fell on his ear. He started, strangely affected. Neither of his companions took notice of it, though it was now past 1 o'clock. It was like a knocking with knuckles against the other side of the wall of the room. "What can that be?" he said, listening for more. "Heard you never that afore, Master Grant?" said the housekeeper. "I hae grown so used till it my ears hardly take notice of it." "What is it?" asked Donal. "Ay, what is it? Tell me that, gien ye can," she returned. "It's just a chappin', and God's truth, it's all I ken about the same. It comes, I believe I'm safe to say, ilka night, but I couldna take my oath upon it. I hae so entirely dropped paying any attention till it. There's things about many an old house, Mr. Grant, 'at'll take the day o' judgment till explain 'em. But so long as they keep to their own side of the wa', I dinna see I need trouble my head about them. Efter the experience I had as a young lass, away doon in England yon'er, at a place my auntie got me intil, for she kenned a heap o' grand folk through being herself so near connected with them as housekeeper in the castle here. Efter that, I'm sayin', I wouldna need to be that easy scared." "What was it?" said Lady Arctura. "I don't think you ever told me." "No, my dear lady, I would hae never thought o' tellin' ye any sic story, so long as ye was ower young no to be frightit at it. For 'deed, I think they're muckle to blame 'at tells bairns the verra things they're no fit to hear, an' fix the dreid afore the sense. But I s' tell ye the noo, gien ye care to hear. It's a some awsome story, but there's something unco foolish like intil it as weel. I canna say I think muckle o' craturs 'at trouble their heads aboot their heads, but that's tellin' aforehand." Here the good woman paused thoughtful. "I am longing to hear your story, Mistress Brookes," said Donal, supposing she needed encouragement. "I'm but thinking how to begin," she returned, "so's to gie ye a right haud o' the thing. I'm thinking I canna do better nor just tell it as it came to mysel'. Well, ye see, I was but a young lass, I might be 20, more or less, when I gaed to the place I spake o'. It was awa upon the borders o' Wales, like as gien folk ower there in Perth were doubtful whether sic and sic a place was in the Hielands or the Lowlands. The maister o' the hoose was a young man awa upon his travels, I kenna where, somewhere upon the continent, but that's a mickle word, and as he had the intention o' being awa for some time to come, no caring to settle down offhand and look after his ain, there was but one gay old woman to housekeep, and me to help her, and a man or two about the place to look after the garden, and that was all. House and garden was to let, and was in the hands of one of the agents, as they call them, for the same purpose, to let, that is, for a term of years. Well, one day there came a gentleman to look at the place, and he was so well pleased with it, as well he might, for it was a bonny place. I laughing like, whaur this place is aye in the sulks. Na, no I dinna mean that, my lady, forgetting that it's yours. But ye maun own it takes a heap o' sun to gar this old house here look anything but some dour, and I beg your pardon, my lady. You are quite right, Mistress Brookes, said Arctura with a smile. If it were not for you, it would be dour. You do not know, Mr. Grant. Mistress Brookes herself does not know how much I owe her. I should have gone out of my mind for very dreariness 100 times but for her. The short and the long of it was, resumed Mistress Brookes, that the place was let and the place was ta'en, mickle to the satisfaction of all parties concerned. The old housekeeper, she being a fixture like, was to bide, and I was to bide as well, under the housekeeper, and have nothing to do with the stranger servants. They came. There was a gentleman of a middle age, and his lady some younger nor himself, handsome but no bonny. But that has nothing to do with my tale, and I should take up your time with it, and it growing some late. Never mind the time, Mistress Brookes, said Arctura. We can do just as we please about that. One time is as good as another, isn't it, Mr. Grant? I sometimes sit up half the night myself, said Donal. I like to know God's night. Only it won't do often, lest we make the brain, which is God's too, like a watch that won't go. It's sair upsetting to the work, said the housekeeper. What would the house be like if I was to do that? Do go on, please, Mistress Brookes, said Arctura. Please do, echoed Donal. Sir, and my lady, I'm ready to sit till the cocks be done crawing, and the day done dawing, to pleasure the one or the two o' ye. And so for my true tale. They were very decent, well-behaved folk, with a fine family, some grown and some growing. It was just a favour to see sic a halesome clan, for at 18 or their way, down to the wee toddling lassie was the very apple o' the eye to all the ane about the place. But that's neither here nor yet there. All goed on as all should gang on where the servants are no ower grand for their own work, nor ower meddlesome with the work of their neighbours. Nothing was neglected, nor anything girned about, but all was peace and harmony, as quo the old sang about our bonnie Kilmeny. That is, till one night. Ye see I'm telling ye as it came to mysel', and not till another. As I lay in my bed that night, and ye may be sure at my age I lay no longer nor just to turn me ower once, and in general not that once. Just as I was falling asleep, up gat such a rummage in the servant hall, straight aneath where I was lying, and I thought to mysel' what upon earth's come to the place. Gin it be no the day o' judgment, truth it's no the day o' small things, I said. It was as gin all the chairs and tables thegither were being rooted out of their places, and syne set back again, and the tables turned heels ower head, and all the glass and all the plate for the dinner knockit about as gin they had been so many hailstones that were not wanted any mair, but might just lie where they fell. I couldna for the life o' me think what it might betoken, save and except a general frenzy had seized upon man and woman in the house. I got up in a hurry. Whatever was going on, I would not willingly gang, wanting my share of the sight. And just as I opened my door, who should I hear but the master crying at the head of the stair, "What in the name of all that's holy," says he, "is the meaning of this?" And I ran till him out of the passage and through the swing door into the great corridor, and says I, "'Deed, sir, I was wondering, and with your leave, sir, I'll gang and see," I said, gathering my shawl about me as well as I could to hide what was aneath it, or rather what was not aneath it, for I had not that muckle on. But says he, "No, no, you must not go. Who knows what it may be? I'll go myself. They may be robbers, and the men fighting them. You stop where you are." Saying that, he was half-ways down the stair. I stood where I was, looking down and hearkening, and the noise still going on. But he could but a won the length of the hall, when it stoppit all at once and all together. You may think what a din it mun have been, when I tell you the quiet that came upon the heels of it just seemed to sting my two lugs. The same moment I heard the maester crying to me to come down. I ran, and when I reached the servants' hall, where he stood just inside the door, I stood aside him and glowered. For would you believe me, the place was as dacent and still as any kirkyard in the moonlight. There was not a thing out of its place, nor an air adist, nor the smallest disorder to be seen. All the things looked as gin they had settled themselves to sleep as usual, and had sleeped till we came and waked them. The maester glowered at me, and I glowered at the maester. But all he said was, "A false alarm, ye see, Rose." What he thought I cannot tell, but without another word we turned, and goed up the stair again together. At the top of the stair, the long corridor ran away into the dark afore us, for the candle the master carried flang na light half to the end of it, and frae out of the mirk on a sudden came to meet us a rampaging and a rattling like a score o' knout running away with their iron tethers about their necks, sic a rattling o' iron chains as ye never heard, and groaning and a grunting just fearsome. Again we stood, and looked at one another, and my word, but the master's face was enough to fright a body of itself, let alone the thing we heard and saw nothing to account for. "Gang away back to your bed, Rose," he said. "This'll never do." "And how are you to help it, sir?" said I. "That I cannot tell," answered he, "but I wouldn't for the world your mistress heard it. I left her fast asleep, and I hope she'll sleep through it. Did ye ever hear anything strange about the house before we came?" "Never, sir," said I. "As sure as I stand here shivering." For the night was in the simmer, and warm to that degree, and yet I was shivering as in the cold fit of a fever, and my mouth would hardly consent to make the words I sought to frame. We stood like mice afore the cat for a minute or two, but there came nothing more, and by degrees we grew a kind o' ashamed, like as gin we had been doubtful as to whether we had heard anything. And when again he said to me gang to my bed, I gaed to my bed, and wasna long upon the road, for fear I would hear anything more, and into my bed and my head aneath the clothes, and lay trembling. But there was none more of it that night, and I wasna owersair overcome to fall asleep. In the morning I told the housekeeper all about it, but she held her tongue in a manner that was, to say the least of it, very strange. She didna laugh, nor she didna grue nor yet glower, nor yet she didna say the thing was nonsense, but she just heard, and said not a word. I thought with myself, is it possible she doesna believe me? But I couldna make that out either. So as she held her tongue, I just pulled the bridle o' mine, and vowed there should never be another word said by me till once she spake hersel'. And I would soon ha' had enough o' holding my tongue, but I had not to hold it to anybody but her, and I came to the conclusion that she was feared to be inspeered questions by them 'at had a right to speir them, for that she had heard o' something afore, and kenned mair nor she was at liberty to speak about. But that was only the beginning, and little to what followed. For frae that night there was not one night passed but some one or two disturbed, and whiles it was past abiding. The noises and the rumblings, and abune all the clanking o' chains that goed on in that house, and the groans and the cries, and whiles the whistling, and what was most waur nor all, the laughing, was something dreadful, and ayont believing to any but them 'at was intil it. I sometimes think maybe the terror of it makes it look waur in the recollection nor it was, but I cannot keep my senses and not believe there was something altogether by ordinary in the affair. And when, or long, it came to the knowledge of the lady, and she was waked up at night, and heard the thing, whatever it was, and syne when the bairns were waked up, and I the rummage now in this room, now in that, so that the living would be crying as loud as the dead, though they could ill make such a din, it was beyond all bearing, and the maester made up his mind to flit at once, come o' it what might. For as I ought to ha' telt ye, he had written to the owner of the house, that was my ain master, for it was not a hair o' use saying anything further to the agent. He only laughed, and declared it maun be some of his own folk was playing tricks upon him, which it angered him to hear, being as impossible as it was false. So straight away to his landlord he wrote, as I say, but as he was travelling about on the continent, he supposed either the letter had not reached him, and never would reach him, or he was sheltering himself under the idea they would think he had never had it, not wanting to move in the matter. But the very day he had made up his mind that nothing should make him spend another week in the house, for Monday nights were always the worst, there came a letter from the gentleman, saying that only that same hour that he was writing had he received the maester's letter, and he was sorry he had not had it before, but prayed him to put up with things till he got to him, and he would start at the farthest in 2 days more, and would set the thing right in less time than it would take to tell him what was amiss. A strange enough letter, to be sure. Mr. Harper, that was their butler, told me he had read every word of it. And so, as, not to mention the terrors of the night, the want o' rest was like to ruin us altogether, we were all on the outlook for the appearance of our promised deliverer, so cock-sure of setting things straight again. Well, at last, and that was in a very few days, though they looked long to some in that house, he appeared. A nice looking gentleman, with so sweet a smile it wasna hard to believe whatever he telt you. And he had a light airy way with him that was to us oppressed craturs strangely comforting, ill as it was to believe he could ken what had been going on, and treat it in that fashion. However, and now, my lady, and Mr. Grant, I had to tell you what the butler told me, for I wasna present to hear for mysel'. Maybe he wouldn't have told me, but that he wasn't an old man, though twice my age, and seemed to have taken a liking to me, though it never came to anything. And as I was always civil to any person that was civil to me, and never went farther than was becomin', he made me the return of talking to me at times, and telling me what he knew. The young gentleman was to stop and lunch with the master, and in the meantime would have a glass of wine and a biscuit, and pulling a bunch of keys from his pocket, he desired Mr. Harper to take a certain one, and go to the door that was locked inside the wine cellar, and bring a bottle from a certain bin. Harper took the key, and was just going from the room, when he heard the visitor, though in truth he was more at home there than any of us, heard him say, "I'll tell you what you've been doing, sir, and you will tell me whether I'm not right." Hearing that, the butler drew the door to, but not that close, and made no haste to leave it, and so heard what followed. "I'll tell you what you've been doing," says he. "Didn't you find a man's head, a skull, I mean, upon the premises?" "Well, yes, I believe we did, when I think of it," says the master, "for my butler," and there was the butler outside a-listening to the whole tale. "My butler came to me one morning, saying, 'Look here, sir, that is what I found in a little box, close by the door of the wine cellar. It's a skull.' 'Oh,' said I, it was the maester that was speaking, 'it'll be some medical student has brought it home to the house.' So he asked me what he had better do with it. 'And you told him,' interrupted the gentleman, 'to bury it.' 'I did. It seemed the proper thing to do.' 'I hadn't a doubt of it,' said the gentleman. 'That is the cause of all the disturbance.' 'That?' says the master. 'That, and nothing else,' answers the gentleman. And with that, as Harper confessed when he told me, there came o'er him such a horror that he dared no longer stand at the door, but for going down to the cellar to fetch the bottle of wine, that was merely beyond his human faculty. As it happed, I met him on the stair, as white as a sheet and ready to drop. 'What's the matter, Mr. Harper?' said I, and he told me all about it. 'Come along,' I said, 'we'll go to the cellar together. It's broad daylight, and there's nothing to hurt us.' So he went down. 'There, that's the box the thing was lying in,' said he, as we came out of the wine cellar. And with that came a groan out of the very ground at our feet. We both heard it, and stood shaking and dumb, gripping one another. 'I'm sure I don't know what in the name of heaven it can all mean,' said he, but that was when we were on the way up again. 'Did you show any disrespect?' said I. 'No,' said he, 'I but buried it, as I would anything else that had to be putting out of sight.' And as we were talking together, that was at the top of the cellar stair, there came a great ringing at the bell, and said he, 'They're wondering what's come of me and their wine, and weel they may. I maun run.' As soon as he entered the room, and this again you may see, my lady and Mr. Grant, he telt me afterwards. 'Where did you bury the head you took frae the cellar?' said his master till him, and speered not a word as to how he had been so long gone for the wine. 'I buried it in the garden,' answered he. 'I hope you know the spot?' said the strange gentleman. 'Yes, sir, I do,' said Harper. 'Then come and show me,' said he. So the three of them went out together and got a spade, and luckily the butler was able to show them at once the very spot. And the gentleman, he howked up the skull with his own hands, careful not to touch it with the spade, and brought it back in his hand to the house, knocking the earth off it with his rough travelling gloves. But when Harper looked to be told to take it back to the place where he found it, and trembled at the thought, wondering how he was to get hold of me and nobody the wiser, for he didn't want to show fright in the daytime, to his great surprise and no small pleasure, the gentleman set the skull on the chimney-piece, and as lunch had been laid in the meantime, for Mr. Heywood, I had just gotten a grip of his name, had to be away again directly, he heard the whole story as he waited upon them. I suppose they thought it better he should hear and tell the rest, the sooner to gar them forget the terrors we had come through. Said the gentleman, 'Now you'll have no more trouble. If you do, write to me to the care of so-and-so, and I'll release you from your agreement. But please to remember that you brought it on yourself by interfering. I can't exactly say with my property, but with the property of one who knows how to defend it without calling in the aid of the law, which indeed would probably give him little satisfaction. It was the burying of that skull that brought on you all the annoyance.' 'I always thought,' said the maester, 'the dead preferred having their bones buried. Their ghosts indeed, according to Cocker, either would not or could not lie quiet until their bodies were properly buried. Where then could be our offence?' 'You may say what you will,' answered Mr. Heywood, 'and I cannot answer you, or pretend to explain the thing, I only know that when that head is buried, these same disagreeables always begin." "Then is the head in the way of being buried and dug up again?" asked the master. "I will tell you the whole story, if you like," answered his landlord. "I would gladly hear it," says he, "for I would fain see daylight on the affair." "That I cannot promise you," he said, "but the story, as it is handed down in the family, you shall hear." You may be sure, my lady, Harper was wide awake to hearken, and the more that he might tell it again in the hall. "Somewhere about 150 years ago," Mr. Heywood began, "on a cold stormy night, there came to the hall door a poor pedlar, a travelling merchant, you know, my lady, with his pack on his back, and would fain have parted with some of his goods to the folk of the hall. The butler, who must have been a rough sort of man, they were rough times those, told him they wanted nothing he could give them, and to go about his business. But the man, who was something obstinate, I dare say, and it may well be anxious to get shelter, as much for the night being girly as to sell his goods, keep it on begging and imploring to let the women folk at the least look at what he had brought. At last the butler, out of all patience with the man, gave him a great shove away fra the door, so that the poor man fell down the steps, and banged the door to, nor ever lookit to see whether the man got up again or no. In the morning, the pedlar they found him lying dead in a little wood or shaw, not far fra the house. And with that up got the cry, and what said they but that the butler had murdered him? So up he was ta'en and put upon his trial for it. And whether the man was not liked in the countryside I cannot tell, said the gentleman, but the cry was against him, and things went the wrong way for him, and that though no one about the house believed he had done the deed, more than he might have caused his death by pushing him down the steps. And even that he could hardly have intended, but only to get quit of him. And likely enough the man was weak, perhaps ill, and the weight of his pack on his back pulled him as he pushed. Still, after an all, and it's mysel that's sayin' this, not the gentleman, my lady, in a part of the country like that, gay and lonely, it was not the night to turn a fellow creature out in. The butler was at the same time an old and trusty servant, said Mr. Heywood, and his master was greatly concerned about the thing. It is impossible at this time of day, he said, to understand how such a thing could be, in the total absence of direct evidence, but the short and the weary long of it was, that the man was hanged, and hung in irons for the deed. And now you may be thinking the ghost of the poor pedlar began to haunt the house, but nothing of the kind. There was no disturbance of that or any other sort. The man was dead and buried, whoever did or did not kill him, and the body of him that was said to have killed him hung dangling in the wind, and neither of them said a word for or again the thing. But the heart of the man's master was sore. He couldna help thinking that maybe he was to blame, and might have done something more nor he thought of at the time to get the poor man off, for he was absolutely certain that, however rough he might have been, and whoever he might have been the cause of death to the troublesome pedlar, he hadn't meant to kill him. It was, in part at least, an accident, and he thought the hanging of him for it was hard lines. The maester was an old man, near hand outy, and took things the mair seriously, I dare say, that he was not that far frae the grave they had sent the poor butler till afore his time, gien that could be said o' one whose grave was with the weathercock. And he took himself to task as to whether he oughtna to ha' done something more, gone to the king maybe, for he couldna bide the thought of the poor man that had waited upon him so long and faithful, hanging and swinging up there, and the flesh dropping off of the bones of him, and still the bones hanging there, and swinging and creaking and crying. The thought, I say, was sair upon the old man. But the time passed, and I kenna how long or how short it may take for a body in sic a position to come asunder, but at last the bones began to drop, and as they droppit, there they lay, at the foot of the gallows, for nobody cared to meddle with them. And when that came to the knowledge of the old gentleman, he sent his folk to gather them up, and bury them out of sight, and what was left of the body, the upper part, holding together with the irons maybe, I kenna weel how, hung and swung there still in ilk wind that blew. But at the last, out o' sorrow and respect for the dead, however he died, his old master sent quietly one mirk night, and had the lave of the bones ta'en down and laid in the earth. But frae that moment, think ye there was any peace in the house? A clanking o' chains got up, and a howling, and a complaining and a creaking like in the wind, sic a stramash altogether, that the house was not fit to be lived in whiles, though it was sometimes waur nor other times, and some thought it had to do with the airt the wind blew. About that I ken naething. But it got on like that for months, maybe years, Mr. Harper was not sure how long the gentleman said, till the old man most wished himself in o' the grave and out o' the trouble. At last one day came an old man to see him, not so old as himself, but one he had kenned when they were at the college together. and this was a man that had travelled greatly, and was weel learnt in a heap o' things ordinary folk that gies themselves to the land and to the growing o' corn and beasts is no likely to ken muckle about. He saw his old friend was in trouble, and didna carry his age calm like as was natural, and so speirt him what was the matter. And he told him the whole story, frae the hangin' to the bangin'. "Well," said the learnt man, when he had heard all, "gien ye'll take my advice, ye'll just send and hook up the head, and take it into the house with ye, and let it bide there where it was used so long to be. Do that, and it's my opinion you'll hear no more o' sic unruly goings on." The old gentleman took the advice, kennin' no better. But it was the right advice, for frae that moment the rumour was o'er. They had no more of it. They laid the head in a decent bit box in the cellar, and there it remained, weel content there to abide the day o' that judgment that'll set many another judgment to the right about. Though what pleasure could be intil that cellar, mair nor intil a hole in the earth, is a thing not for me to say. So with that generation there was no more trouble. But in the course o' time came first one and syne another, who forgot, maybe left at the whole affair, and did not believe a word of the same. But they're but fools that gang again the experience of their forebears. What would ye have but they would bury the head? And what would come o' that but an old dismay het up again? Up gat the din, the rampagin', the clankin' and all, just the same as afore. But the minute that, frighted at the consequences of their folly, they acknowledged the property of the ghost in his own head, and took it out of the earth and into the house again, all was quiet directly, quiet as heart could desire. So that was the story. And when the lunch was o'er, and Mr. Harper was thinking the moment come when they would order him to take the head, and him trembling at the thought of touching it, and lay it where it was, and where it had so often been when it had a soul intil it, the gentleman got up, and he says till him, "Be so good," says he, "as fetch me my hat box from the hall." Harper went and got it as desired, and the gentleman took and unlocked it, and round he turnt where he stood, and up he took the skull frae the chimley piece, neither as gien he loved it nor feared it, as what reason had he to do either, and handled it neither roughly nor with any show o' mickle care, but into the hat box it gaed willy-nilly, and the lid shutting down upon it, and the key turnt in the lock of it, and as gien he would make the thing right sure o' not being putten again where it had sic an objection to gang, up he took in his hand the hat box, and the contrary head in the inside of it, and away with him on his travels, here away and there away o'er the face of the globe. He was on his way to Spain, he said, at the moment, and we saw no more o' him nor the head, nor heard ever a sound more o' clanking nor gurning nor any other unholy din. And that's the truth. Make of it what ye like, my lady and Master Grant." Mistress Brookes was silent, and for some time not a syllable was uttered by either listener. At last Donal spoke. "It is a strange story, Mistress Brookes," he said, "and the stranger that it would show some of the inhabitants of the other world apparently as silly after 150 years as when first they arrived there." "I can say nothing anent that, sir," answered Mistress Brookes. "I'm not accountable for any inference that's to be drawn from it or true tale, and doubtless, sir, ye ken far better nor me. But where ye see many folk draw out the thread of a long life, and never one sensible thing that they could help done or said, what for should ye wonder gien now and then one in the other world show himself sick like? When ye consider the heap o' folk that dies, and how there maun be so many mair in the other world nor in this, I confess for my part, I wonder more it were left at peace at all, and that they come not swarming about us in the night, like black doves. Ye'll maybe say they cannot, and ye'll maybe say they come, but so long as they plague me no waur nor a friend upon the tither side of the wall, I cannot say that I care that mickle. But I think whiles how the ghosts maun laugh at them 'at laughs as gien there were no such creatures in the world. For my part, I neither fear them nor seek till them. I'll be one with them myself afore long. Only I would sair wuss and hope to gang in among better behaved ones nor them 'at gangs about plaguing folk." "You speak the best of sense, Mistress Brookes," said Donal. "But I should like to understand why the poor hanged fellow should have such an objection to having his skull laid in the ground. Why had he such a fancy for his old bones? Could he be so closely associated with them that he could not get on without the plenty of fresh air they got him used to when they hung on the gallows? And why did it content him to have only his head above ground? It is bewildering. We couldn't believe our bones rise again, even if Paul hadn't as good as told us they don't. Why should the dead haunt their bones, as if to make sure of having their own again?" "But," said Mistress Brookes, "begging your pardon, sir, what ken ye as to what they think? Ye may ken better, but maybe they dinna. For haena ye just allowed that such conduct as I hae described it is no fit, whoever be guilty of the same, whether rowdy laddies in the street, or creatures ye cannot see in the house? They may think they'll want their bones by and by, though ye ken better. And whatever ye wise folk may think the noo, ye ken it's not that long sin' a'body, aye the best of folk, thought the same. And there's no a doubt they all did at the time that man was hanged. And ye maun mind that in the house the head o' him wouldna waste as it would in the yard. But why bother about his head more than the rest of his bones? Well, sir, I'm thinking a ghost, ghost though he be, cannot surely be in two places at once. He could never think to plague till ilk bone of finger and toe was gathered in the cellar. That would be hopeless. And thinking anything of his bones, he might well think most of his head, and keep an eye upon that. Not many ghosts hae the chance of seeing so muckle of their bones as this one, or saying to themselves, "Yon's mine, where it swings." Some ghosts have a cat-like nature for places, and what for no for bones? Mony's the story that housekeeper, honest woman, telled me. When what had come was gone, it set her opening out her pack. I could hold ye there all night, telling ye one after another of them. But it's time to gang to our beds. It is our turn to tell you something, said Lady Arctura, only you must not mention it just yet. Mr. Grant has found the lost room. For a moment Mrs. Brooks said nothing, but neither paled nor looked incredulous. Her face was only fixed and still, as if she were finding explanation in the discovery. "I was aye o' the mind it was," she said, "and many's the time I thought I would look for it to please mysel'. It's small wonder, the sounds and the raps and such like." "You will not change your mind when you hear all," said Arctura. "I asked you to give us our supper, because I was afraid to go to bed." "You shouldn't have told her, sir." "I've seen it with my own eyes." "You have been into it, my lady! What? It is a chapel, the old castle chapel, mentioned, I know, somewhere in the history of the place, though no one, I suppose, ever dreamed the missing room could be that. And in the chapel," continued Arctura, hardly able to bring out the words, for a kind of cramping of the muscles of speech, "there was a bed, and in the bed the crumbling dust of a woman, and on the altar what was hardly more than the dusty shadow of a baby." "The Lord be about us!" cried the housekeeper, her well-seasoned composure giving way. "Ye saw that with your own eyen, my lady! Mr. Grant, how could ye let her ladyship look upon such things?" "I am her ladyship's servant," answered Donal. "That's verra true, but my bonnie bairn, sich sights is not for you." "I ought to know what is in the house," said Arctura, with a shudder. "But already I feel more comfortable that you know too. Mr. Grant would like to have your advice as to what— You'll come and see them, won't you?" "When you please, my lady. To-night?" "No, no, not to-night. Was that the knocking again? Some ghosts want their bodies to be buried, though your butler—" "I wouldna wonder," responded Mistress Brooks thoughtfully. "Where shall we bury them?" asked Donal. "In England," said the housekeeper, "I used to hear a heap about consecrated ground, but to my mind it was the bodies o' God's handiwork, not the bishop, that consecrated the ground. Where the Lord lays down what he has done with, would aye be a sacred place to me. I dare say Moses, when he came upon it again in the desert, looked upon the ground where stood the bush where it burned, as a sacred place, though the fire was long out. Think na ye, Mr. Grant?" "I do," answered Donal. "But I do not believe the Lord Jesus thought one spot on the face of the earth more holy than another. Every dust of it was his Father's, neither more nor less, existing only by the thought of that Father. And I think that is what we must come to. But where shall we bury them? Where they lie, or in the garden?" "Some would doubtless hae dust laid to dust in the kirkyard, but I would not willingly raise a clash in the country side. Them that did it was your ain forebears, my lady, and such things are weel forgotten. And syne what would the earl say? It might upset him mair nor a bit. I'll consider of it." Donal accompanied them to the door of the chamber which again they shared, and then betook himself to his own high nest. There more than once in what remained of the night, he woke, fancying he heard the ghost music sounding its coronach over the dead below. End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant by George MacDonald. Chapter 58. A Soul Diseased. "Papa is very ill to-day, Simmons tells me," said Davy, as Donal entered the schoolroom. "He says he has never seen him so ill. Oh, Mr. Grant, I hope he is not going to die." "I hope not," returned Donal, not very sure, he saw when he thought about it, what he meant. For if there was so little hope of his becoming a true man on this side of some awful doom, why should he hope for his life here? "I wish you would talk to him as you do to me, Mr. Grant," resumed Davy, who thought what had been good for himself must be good for everybody. Of late the boy had been more than usual with his father, and he may have dropped some word that turned his father's thoughts toward Donal and his ways of thinking. However weak the earl's will, and however dull his conscience, his mind was far from being inactive. In the afternoon the butler brought a message that his lordship would be glad to see Mr. Grant when school was over. Donal found the earl very weak, but more like a live man, he thought, than he had yet seen him. He pointed to a seat and began to talk in a way that considerably astonished the tutor. "Mr. Grant," he began, with not a little formality, "I have known you long enough to believe I know you really. Now I find myself, partly from the peculiarity of my constitution, partly from the state of my health, partly from the fact that my views do not coincide with those of the Church of Scotland, and there is no episcopal clergyman within reach of the castle, I find myself, I say, for these reasons, desirous of some conversation with you, more for the sake of identifying my own opinions, than in the hope of receiving from you what it would be unreasonable to expect from one of your years." Donal held his peace. The very power of speech seemed taken from him. He had no confidence in the man, and nothing so quenches speech as lack of faith. But the earl had no idea of this distrust, never a doubt of his listener's readiness to take any position he required him to take. Experience had taught him as little about Donal as about his own real self. "I have long been troubled," continued his lordship after a momentary pause, "with a question of which one might think the world must by this time be weary, which yet has, and always will have, extraordinary fascination for minds of a certain sort, of which my own is one. It is the question of the freedom of the will. How far is the will free, or how far can it be called free, consistently with the notion of a God over all?" He paused, and Donal sat silent, so long that his lordship opened the eyes which, the better to enjoy the process of sentence-making, he had kept shut, and half turned his head towards him. He had begun to doubt whether he was really by his bedside, or but one of his many visions, undistinguishable by him from realities. Reassured by the glance, he resumed. "I cannot, of course, expect from you such an exhaustive and formed opinion as from an older man who had made metaphysics his business, and acquainted himself with all that had been said upon the subject. At the same time you must have expended a considerable amount of thought on these matters." He talked in a quiet, level manner, almost without inflection, and with his eyes again closed, very much as if he were reading a book inside him. "I have had a good deal," he went on, "to shake my belief in the common ideas on such points. Do you believe there is such a thing as free will?" He ceased, awaiting the answer which Donal felt far from prepared to give him. "My lord," he said at length, "what I believe I do not feel capable at a moment's notice of setting forth. Neither do I think, however unavoidable such discussions may be in the forum of one's own thoughts, that they are profitable between men. I think such questions, if they are to be treated at all between man and man, and not between God and man only, had better be discussed in print, where what is said is in some measure fixed, and can with a glance be considered afresh. But not so either do I think they can be discussed to any profit." "What do you mean? Surely this question is of the first importance to humanity." "I grant it, my lord, if by humanity you mean the human individual. But my meaning is, that there are many questions, and this one, that can be tested better than argued." "You seem fond of paradox." "I will speak as directly as I can. Such questions are to be answered only by the moral nature, which first and almost only they concern, and the moral nature operates in action, not discussion." "Do I not then," said his lordship, the faintest shadow of indignation in his tone, "bring my moral nature to bear on a question which I consider from the ground of duty?" "No, my lord," answered Donal with decision. "You bring nothing but your intellectual nature to bear on it so. The moral nature, I repeat, operates only in action. To come to the point in hand, the sole way for a man to know he has freedom is to do something he ought to do which he would rather not do. He may strive to acquaint himself with the facts concerning will, and spend himself imagining its mode of working, yet all the time not know whether he has any will. But how am I to put a force in operation while I do not know whether I possess it or not? By putting it on operation. That alone. By being alive, by doing the next thing you ought to do, or abstaining from the next thing you are tempted to, knowing you ought not to do it. It sounds childish, and most people set action aside as what will do any time, and try first to settle questions which never can be settled but in just this divinely childish way. For not merely is it the only way in which a man can know whether he has a free will, but the man has in fact no will at all unless it comes into being in such action. Suppose he found he had no will, for he could not do what he wished. What he ought, I said, my lord. Well, what he ought, yielded the earl, almost angrily. He could not find it proved that he had no faculty for generating a free will. He might indeed doubt it the more, but the positive only, not the negative, can be proved. Where would be the satisfaction if he could only prove the one thing and not the other? The truth alone can be proved, my lord. How should a lie be proved? The man that wanted to prove he had no freedom of will would find no satisfaction from his test, and the less the more honest he was. But the man anxious about the dignity of the nature given him would find every needful satisfaction in the progress of his obedience. How can there be free will where the first thing demanded for its existence or knowledge of itself is obedience? There is no free will save in resisting what one would like and doing what the truth would have him do. It is true the man's liking and the truth may coincide, but therein he will not learn his freedom, though in such coincidence he will always thereafter find it, and in such coincidence alone, for freedom is harmony with the originating law of one's existence. That's dreary doctrine. My lord, I have spent no little time and thought on the subject, and the result is some sort of practical clearness to myself. But were it possible, I should not care to make it clear to another, save by persuading him to arrive at the same conviction by the same path, that namely of doing the thing required of him. Required of him by what? By any one, any thing, any thought with which can go the word required by, anything that carries right in its demand. If a man does not do the thing which the very notion of a free will requires, what in earth, heaven, or hell would be the use of his knowing all about the will? But it is impossible he should know anything. You are a bold preacher, said the earl. Suppose now a man was unconscious of any ability to do the thing required of him. I should say there was the more need he should do the thing. That is nonsense. If it be nonsense, the nonsense lies in the supposition that a man can be conscious of not possessing a power. He can only be not conscious of possessing it, and that is a very different thing. How is a power to be known but by being a power? And how is it to be a power but in its own exercise of itself? There is more in man than he can at any given moment be conscious of. There is life, the power of the eternal, behind his consciousness, which only in action can he make his own, of which therefore only in action, that is obedience, can he become conscious, for then only is it his. You are splitting a hair. If the only way to life lay through a hair, what must you do but split it? The fact, however, is, that he who takes the live sphere of truth for a flat intellectual disc, may well take the disc's edge for a hair. Come, come, how does all this apply to me, a man who would really like to make up his mind about the thing, and is not at the moment aware of any very pressing duty that he is neglecting to do? Is your lordship not aware of some not very pressing duty that you are neglecting to do? Some duties need but to be acknowledged by the smallest amount of action to become paramount in their demands upon us. That is the worst of it, murmured the earl. I refuse. I avoid such acknowledgment. Who knows whither it might carry me, or what it might not go on to demand of me? He spoke like one unaware that he spoke. Yes, my lord, said Donal, that is how most men treat the greatest things. The devil blinds us that he may guide us. The devil! Bah! cried his lordship, glad to turn at right angles from the path of the conversation. You don't surely believe in that legendary personage? He who does what the devil would have him do is the man who believes in him, not he who does not care whether he is or not, so long as he avoids doing his work. If there be such a one, his last thought must be to persuade men of his existence. He is a subject I do not care to discuss. He is not very interesting to me. But if your lordship now would but overcome the habit of depending on medicine, you would soon find out that you had a free will." His lordship scowled like a thundercloud. "I am certain, my lord," added Donal, "that the least question asked by the will itself will bring an answer. 1,000 asked by the intellect will bring nothing." "I did not send for you to act the part of Father Confessor, Mr. Grant," said his lordship, in a tone which rather perplexed Donal. "But as you have taken upon you the office, I may as well allow you keep it. The matter to which you refer, that of my medical treatment of myself, is precisely what has brought me into my present difficulty. It would be too long a story to tell you how, like poor Coleridge, I was first decoyed, then enticed from one stage to another. The desire to escape from pain is a natural instinct. And that, and the necessity also for escaping my past self, especially in its relations to certain others, have brought me by degrees into far too great a dependence on the use of drugs. And now that, from certain symptoms, I have ground to fear a change of some kind not so far off, I do not of course mean tomorrow or next year, but somewhere nearer than it was this time, I won't say last year, but say 10 years ago, why then, one begins to think about things one has been too ready to forget. I suppose, however, if the will be a natural possession of the human being, and if a man should, through actions on the tissue of his brain, have ceased to be conscious of any will, it must return to him the moment he is free from the body, that is, from the dilapidated brain." "My lord, I would not have you count too much upon that. We know very little about these things. But what if the brain give the opportunity for the action which is to result in freedom? What if there should, without the brain, be no means of working our liberty? What if we are here like birds in a cage, with wings, able to fly, but not flying about the cage? And what if, when we are dead, we shall indeed be out of the cage, but without wings, having never made use of such as we had while we had them? Think for a moment what we should be without the senses. We shall be able at least to see and hear, else where were the use of believing in another world? I suspect, my lord, the other world does not need our believing in it to make a fact of it. But if a man were never to teach his soul to see, if he were obstinately to close his eyes upon this world, and look at nothing all the time he was in it, I should be very doubtful whether the mere fact of going a little more dead would make him see. The soul never having learned to see, its sense of seeing, correspondent to and higher than that of the body, never having been developed, how should it expand and empower itself by mere deliverance from the one best schoolmaster to whom it would give no heed? The senses are, I suspect, only the husks under which are ripening the deeper, keener, better senses belonging to the next stage of our life. And so, my lord, I cannot think that, if the will has not been developed through the means and occasions given it, the mere passing into another condition will set it free. For freedom is the unclosing of the idea which lies at our root, and is the vital power of our existence. The rose is the freedom of the rose-tree. I should think, having lost his brain, and got nothing instead, a man would find himself a mere centre of unanswerable questions." "You go too far for me," said his lordship, looking a little uncomfortable. "But I think it is time to try and break myself a little of the habit, or almost time. By degrees one might, you know, eh?" "I have little faith in doing things by degrees, my lord, except such indeed as by their very nature cannot be done at once. It is true a bad habit can only be contracted by degrees, and I will not say, because I do not know, whether anyone has ever cured himself of one by degrees, but it cannot be the best way. What is bad ought to be got rid of at once." "Ah, but don't you know? That might cost you your life." "What of that, my lord? Life, the life you mean, is not the first thing." "Not the first thing? Why, the Bible says, 'All that a man hath will he give for his life.'" "That is in the Bible, but whether the Bible says it is another thing." "I do not understand silly distinctions." "Why, my lord, who said that?" "What does it matter who said it?" "Much, always. Everything sometimes." "Who said it, then?" "The devil." "The devil he did. And who ought to know better, I should like to ask?" "Every man ought to know better. And besides, it is not what a man will or will not do, but what a man ought or ought not to do." "Ah, there you have me, I suppose. But there are some things so damned difficult, that a man must be very sure of his danger before he can bring himself to do them." "That may be, my lord. In the present case, however, you must be aware that the danger is not to the bodily health alone. These drugs undermine the moral nature as well." "I know it. I cannot be counted guilty of many things, They were done under the influence of hellish concoctions. It was not I, but these things working in me, on my brain, making me see things in a false light. This will be taken into account when I come to be judged, if there be such a thing as the day of judgment." "One thing I am sure of," said Donal, "that your lordship will have fair play. At first, not quite knowing what you were about, you may not have been much to blame. But afterwards, when you knew that you were putting yourself in danger of doing you did not know what, you were as much to blame as if you made a Frankenstein demon and turned him loose on the earth, knowing yourself utterly unable to control him." "And is not that what the God you believe in does every day?" "My lord, the God I believe in has not lost his control over either of us." "Then let him set the thing right. Why should we draw his plough?" "He will set it right, my lord, but probably in a way your lordship will not like. He is compelled to do terrible things sometimes." "Compelled? What should compel him?" "The love that is in him, the love that he is. He cannot let us have our own way to the ruin of everything in us he cares for." Then the Spirit awoke in Donal, or came upon him, and he spoke. "My lord," he said, "if you would ever again be able to thank God, if there be one in the other world to whom you would go, if you would make up for any wrong you have ever done, if you would ever feel in your soul once more the innocence of a child, if you care to call God your Father, if you would fall asleep in peace and wake to a new life, I conjure you to resist the devil, to give up the evil habit that is dragging you lower and lower every hour. It will be very hard, I know. Anything I can do, watching with you night and day, giving myself to help you, I am ready for. I will do all that lies in me to deliver you from the weariness and sickness of the endeavour. I will give my life to strengthen yours, and count it well spent and myself honoured. I shall then have lived a life worth living. Resolve, my lord. In God's name, resolve at once to be free. Then you shall know you have a free will, for your will have made itself free by doing the will of God, against all disinclination of your own. It will be a glorious victory, and will set you high on the hill whose peak is the throne of God." "I will begin to-morrow," said the earl feebly, and with a strange look in his eyes. "But now you must leave me. I need solitude to strengthen my resolve. Come to me again to-morrow. I am weary, and must rest a while. Send Simmons." Donal was nowise misled by the easy, postponed consent, but he could not prolong the interview. He rose and went. In the act of shutting the door behind him, something, he did not know what, made him turn his head. The earl was leaning over the little table by his bedside, and pouring something from a bottle into a glass. Donal stood transfixed. The earl turned and saw him, cast on him a look almost of demoniacal hate, put the glass to his lips and drank off its contents, then threw himself back on his pillows. Donal shut the door, not so softly as he intended, for he was agitated. A loud curse at the noise came after him. He went down the stair not only with a sense of failure, but with an exhaustion such as he had never before felt. There are men of natures so inactive that they cannot even enjoy the sight of activity around them. Men with schemes and desires are in their presence intrusive. Their existence is a sleepy lake, which would not be troubled even with the wind of far-off labour. Such Lord Morven was not by nature. Up to manhood he had led even a stormy life. But when his passions began to yield, his self-indulgence began to take the form of laziness, and it was not many years before he lay with never a struggle in the chains of the evil power which had now reduced him to moral poltroonery. The tyranny of this last wickedness grew worse after the death of his wife. The one object of his life, if life it could be called, was only and ever to make it a life of his own, not the life which God had meant it to be, and had made possible to him. On first acquaintance with the moral phenomenon, it had seemed to Donal an inhuman and strangely exceptional one. But reflecting, he came presently to see that it was only a more pronounced form of the universal human disease, a disease so deep-seated that he who has it worst least knows or can believe that he has any disease, attributing all his discomfort to the condition of things outside him, whereas his refusal to accept them as they are is one most prominent symptom of the disease. Whether by stimulants or narcotics, whether by company or ambition, whether by grasping or study, whether by self-indulgence, by art, by books, by religion, by love, by benevolence, we endeavour after another life than that which God means for us, a life of truth, namely, Of obedience, humility, and self-forgetfulness we walk equally in a vain show. For God alone is, and without him we are not. This is not the mere clang of a tinkling metaphysical cymbal. He that endeavours to live apart from God must at length find, not merely that he has been walking in a vain show, but that he has been himself but the phantom of a dream. But for the life of the living God, making him be and keeping him being, he must fade even out of the limbo of vanities. He more and more seldom went out of the house, more and more seldom left his apartment. At times he would read a great deal, then for days would not open a book, but seem absorbed in meditation, a meditation which had nothing in it worthy of the name. In his communications with Donal, he did not seem in the least aware that he had made him the holder of a secret by which he could frustrate his plans for his family. These plans he clung to, partly from paternity, partly from contempt for society, and partly in the fancy of repairing the wrong he had done his children's mother. The morally diseased will atone for wrong by fresh wrong, in its turn to demand like reparation. He would do anything now to secure his sons in the position of which in law he had deprived them by the wrong he had done the woman whom all had believed his wife. Through the marriage of the eldest with the heiress, he would make him the head of the house in power as in dignity, and this was now almost the only tie that bound him to the reality of things. He cared little enough about Forgue, but his conscience was haunted with his cruelties to the youth's mother. These were often such as I dare not put on record. They came all of the pride of self-love and self-worship, as evil demons as ever raged in the fiercest fire of Moloch. In the madness with which they possessed him, he had inflicted upon her not only sorest humiliations, but bodily tortures. He would see, he said, what she would bear for his sake. In the horrible presentments of his drug-procured dreams, they returned upon him in terrible forms of righteous retaliation. And now, though to himself he was constantly denying a life beyond, the conviction had begun to visit and overwhelm him that he must one day meet her again. Fain then would he be armed with something which for her sake he had done for her children. One of the horrible laws of the false existence he led was that, for the deadening of the mind to any evil, there was no necessity it should be done and done again. It had but to be presented in the form of a thing done, or a thing going to be done, to seem a thing reasonable and doable. In his being, a world of false appearances had taken the place of reality. A creation of his own had displaced the creation of the essential life, by whose power alone he himself falsely created, and in this world he was the dupe of his own home-born phantoms. Out of this conspiracy of marsh and mirage, what vile things might not issue! Over such a chaos, the devil has power all but creative. He cannot in truth create, but he can with the degenerate created work moral horrors too hideous to be analogized by any of the horrors of the unperfected animal world. Such are being constantly produced in human society. Many of them die in the darkness in which they are generated. Now and then one issues, blasting the public day with its hideous glare. Because they are seldom seen, many deny they exist, or need be spoken of if they do. But to terrify a man at the possibilities of his neglected nature is to do something towards the redemption of that nature. School hours were over, but Davy was seated where he had left him, still working. At sight of him, Donal, feeling as if he had just come from the presence of the damned, almost burst into tears. A moment more, and Arctura entered. It was as if the roof of hell gave way, and the blue sky of the eternal came pouring in heavenly deluge through the ruined vault. "I have been to call upon Sophia," she said. "I am glad to hear it," answered Donal. Any news from an outer world of yet salvable humanity was welcome as summer to a land of ice. "Yes," she said, "I am able to go and see her now, because I am no longer afraid of her. Partly, I think, because I no longer care what she thinks of me. Her power over me is gone." "And will never return," said Donal, "while you keep close to the Master. With him you need no human being to set you right, and will allow no human being to set you wrong. You will need neither friend nor minister nor church, though all will help you. I am very glad, for something seems to tell me I shall not be long here." Arctura dropped on a chair, pale as rosy before. "Has anything fresh happened?" she asked. in a low voice that did not sound like hers. "Surely you will not leave me while— I thought— what is it?" "It is only a feeling I have," he answered. "I believe I am out of spirits." "I never saw you so before," said Arctura. "I hope you are not going to be ill." "Oh no, it is not that. I will tell you some day, but I cannot now. All is in God's hands." She looked anxiously at him, but did not ask him any question more. She proposed they should take a turn in the park, and his gloom wore gradually off. Chapter 58. Chapter 59 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 59. Dust to Dust. The next night, as if by a common understanding, for it was without word spoken, the three met again in the housekeeper's room, where she had supper waiting. Of business nothing was said until that was over. Mistress Brookes told them 2 or 3 of the stories of which she had so many, and Donal recounted 1 or 2 of those that floated about his countryside. "I've been thinking," said Mistress Brookes at length, "seeing it's a bonny starry night, we couldna do better than lift and lay down this very night. The hoose is asleep." "What do you say to that place in the park where was once a mausoleum?" said Donal. "It's the verra place, and the sooner the better. Dinna ye think, my lady?" Arctura, with a look, referred the question to Donal. "Surely," he answered. "But will there not be some preparations to make?" "There's no need o' many," returned the housekeeper. "I'll get a fine old sheet, and intil it we'll put the remains, and row them up, and carry them to their home. I'll go and get it, my lady." "But wouldna it be better for you and me, sir, to get all that done by ourselves? My lady could join us when we came up." "She wouldn't like to be left here alone. There is nothing to be called fearsome." "Nothing at all," said Arctura. "The forces of nature," said Donal, "are constantly at work to destroy the dreadful, and restore the wholesome. It is but a few handfuls of clean dust." The housekeeper went to one of her presses, and brought out a sheet. Donal put a plaid round lady Arctura. They went up to her room, and so down to the chapel. Half-way down the narrow descent, Mistress Brookes murmured, "Eh, sirs," and said no more. Each carried a light, and the 2 could see the chapel better. A stately little place it was. When the windows were unmasked, it would be beautiful. They stood for some moments by the side of the bed, regarding in silence. Seldom sure had bed borne one who slept so long, one who, never waking, might lie there still. When they spoke, it was in whispers. "How are we to manage it, Mistress Brookes?" said Donal. "Lay the sheet handy, along the side of the bed, Master Grant, and I shall lay in the dust, handful by handful. I hae that respect for the dead, I hae no difficulty about handling anything belonging to them." "Gien it hadna been that he took it again," said Donal, "the Lord's own body would hae come to this." As he spoke, he laid the sheet on the bed, and began to lay in it the dry dust and air-wasted bones, handling them as reverently as if the spirit had but just departed. Mistress Brookes would have prevented Arctura, but she insisted on having her share in the burying of her own. Who they were, God knew, but they should be hers anyhow, and one day she would know. For to fancy we go into the other world a set of spiritual moles burrowing in the dark of a new and unknown existence, is worthy only of such as have a lifeless law to their sire. We shall enter it as children with a history, as children going home to a long line of living ancestors, to develop closest relations with them. She would yet talk, live face to face, with those whose dust she was now lifting in her 2 hands to restore it to its dust. Then they carried the sheet to the altar, and thence swept into it every little particle, back to its mother dust. That done, Donal knotted the sheet together, and they began to look around them. Desirous of discovering where the main entrance to the chapel had been, Donal spied under the windows a second door, and opened it with difficulty. It disclosed a passage below the stair, 3 steps lower than the floor of the chapel, parallel with the wall, and turning at right angles under the gallery. Here he saw signs of an obliterated door in the outer wall, but could examine no farther for the present. In the meantime, his companions had made another sort of discovery. Near the foot of the bed was a little table, on which were 2 drinking vessels, apparently of pewter, and a mouldering pack of cards. Card-playing and the hidden room did hold some relation with each other. The cards and the devil were real. Donal took up the sheet, a light burden, and Arctura led the way. Arrived at her room, they went softly across to the door opening on Donal's stair, not without fear of the earl, whom indeed they might meet anywhere, and by that descending, reached the open air, and took their way down the terraces and through the park to the place of burial. It was a frosty night, with the waning sickle of a moon low in the heaven, and many brilliant stars above it. Followed by faint ethereal shadows, they passed over the grass, through the ghostly luminous dusk, of funereal processions one of the strangest that ever sought a tomb. The ruin was in a hollow, surrounded by trees. Donal removed a number of fallen stones, and dug a grave. They lowered into it the knotted sheet, threw in the earth again, heaped the stones above, and left the dust with its dust. Then silent they went back, straight along the green, moon-regarded rather than moonlit grass. If anyone had seen them through the pale starry night, he would surely have taken them for a procession of the dead themselves. No dream of death sought Arctura that night, but in the morning she woke suddenly from one of disembodied delight. End of chapter 59. Chapter 60 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 60. A Lesson about Death. Whatever Lady Arctura might decide concerning the restoration of the chapel to the light of day, Donal thought it would not be amiss to find, without troubling her, what he could of its relation to the rest of the house, and it favoured his wish that Arctura was prevailed upon by the housekeeper to remain in bed the next day. Her strong will, good courage, and trusting heart had made severe demands upon an organization as delicate as responsive. It was now Saturday. He resolved to go alone in the afternoon to explore, and first of all would try the door beside the little gallery. As soon as he was free, he got the tools he judged necessary, and went down. The door was of strong sound oak, with ornate iron hinges right across it. He was on the better side for opening it, that is, the inside, but though the ends of the hinges were exposed, the door was so well within the frame that it was useless to think of heaving them off the bearing pins. The huge lock and its bolt were likewise before him, but the key was in the lock from the other side, so that it could not be picked, while the nails that fastened it to the door were probably riveted through a plate. But there was the socket into which the bolt shot. That was merely an iron staple. He might either force it out with a lever, or file it through. Having removed the roughest of the rust with which it was caked, and so reduced its thickness considerably, he set himself to the task of filing it through, first at the top, then at the bottom. It was a slow but sure process, and would make no great noise. Although it was broad daylight outside, so like midnight was it here, and the season that belongs to the dead, that he was haunted with the idea of a presence behind him. But not once did he turn his head to see, for he knew that if he yielded to the inclination it would but return the stronger. Old experience had taught him that the way to meet the horrors of the fancy is to refuse them a single hair's breadth of obedience. And as he worked, the conviction grew that the only protection against the terrors of alien presence is the consciousness of the home presence of the eternal. If a man felt that presence, how could he fear any other? But for those who are not one with the source of being, every manifestation of that being in a life other than their own must be more or less a terror to them. It is alien, antipathous, other. It may be unappeasable, implacable. The time must even come when to such their own being will be a horror of repugnant consciousness. For God, not self, is ours. His being, not our own, is our home. He is our kind. The work was slow, the impression on the hard iron of the worn file so weak that he was often on the point of giving up the attempt. Fatigue at length began to invade him, and therewith the sense of his situation grew more keen. Great weariness overcomes terror. The beginnings of weariness enhance it. Every now and then he would stop, thinking he heard the cry of a child, only to recognize it as the noise of his file. He resolved at last to stop for the night, and after tea go to the town to buy a new and fitter file. The next day was Sunday, and in the afternoon Donal and Davy were walking in the old avenue together. They had been to church, and had heard a dull sermon on the most stirring fact next to the resurrection of the Lord himself, his raising of Lazarus. The whole aspect of the theme, as presented by the preaching man, was so dull and unreal, that not a word on the subject had passed between them on the way home. "Mr. Grant, how could anybody make a dead man live again?" said Davy suddenly. "I don't know, Davy," answered Donal. "If I could know how, I should probably be able to do it myself." "It is very hard to believe." "Yes, very hard. That is, if you do not know anything about the person said to have done it, to account for his being able to do it, though another could not. But just think of this. If one had never seen or heard about death, it would be as hard, perhaps harder, to believe that anything could bring about that change. The one seems to us easy to understand, because we are familiar with it. If we had seen the other take place a few times, we should see in it nothing too strange, nothing indeed but what was to be expected in certain circumstances. But that is not enough to prove it ever did take place. Assuredly not. It cannot even make it look in the least probable." "Tell me, please, anything that would make it look probable." "I will not answer your question directly, but I will answer it. Listen, Davy. In all ages men have longed to see God, some men in a grand way. At last, according to the story of the gospel, the time came when it was fit that the Father of men should show himself to them in his Son, the one perfect man, who was his very image. So Jesus came to them. But many would not believe he was the Son of God, for they knew God so little that they did not see how like he was to his Father. Others, who were more like God themselves, and so knew God better, did think him the Son of God, though they were not pleased that he did not make more show. His object was not to rule over them, but to make them know and trust and obey his Father, who was everything to him. Now, when anyone died, his friends were so miserable over him that they hardly thought about God, and took no comfort from him. They said the dead man would rise again at the last day, but that was so far off, the dead was gone to such a distance, that they did not care for that. Jesus wanted to make them know and feel that the dead were alive all the time, and could not be far away, seeing they were all with God in whom we live. That they had not lost them, even though they could not see them, for they were quite within his reach, as much so as ever, that they were just as safe with and as well looked after by his Father and their Father as they had ever been in all their lives. It was no doubt a dreadful-looking thing to have them put in a hole and waste away to dust, but they were not therefore gone out, they were only gone in. To teach them all this he did not say much, but just called one or two of them back for a while. Of course Lazarus was going to die again, but can you think his two sisters either loved him less or wept as much over him the next time he died? No, it would have been foolish. Well, if you think about it, you will see that no one who believes that story and weeps as they did the first time can escape reproof. Where Jesus called Lazarus from, there are his friends, and there are they waiting for him. Now I ask you, Davy, was it worth while for Jesus to do this for us? Is not the great misery of our life that those dear to us die? Was it, I say, a thing worth doing, to let us see that they are alive with God all the time, and can be produced any moment he pleases? Surely it was, sir. It ought to take away all the misery. Then it was a natural thing to do, and it is a reasonable thing to think that it was done. It was natural that God should want to let his children see him, and natural he should let them know that he still saw and cared for those they had lost sight of. The whole thing seems to me reasonable. I can believe it. It implies, indeed, a world of things of which we know nothing, but that is for, not against it, seeing such a world we need. And if anyone insists on believing nothing but what he has seen something like, I leave him to his misery, and the mercy of God. If the world had been so made that men could easily believe in the Maker of it, it would not have been a world worth any man's living in. Neither would the God that made such a world, and so revealed himself to such people, be worth believing in. God alone knows what life is enough for us to live, what life is worth his and our while. We may be sure he is labouring to make it ours. He would have it as full, as lovely, as grand as the sparing of nothing, not even his own Son can render it. If we would only let him have his own way with us. If we do not trust him, will not work with him, are always thwarting his endeavours to make us alive, then we must be miserable. There is no help for it. As to death, we know next to nothing about it. Do we not? Say the faithless. Do we not know the darkness, the emptiness, the tears, the sinkings of heart, the desolation? Yes, you know those, but those are your things, not death's. About death you know nothing. God has told us only that the dead are alive to him, and that one day they will be alive again to us. The world beyond the gates of death is, I suspect, a far more home-like place to those that enter it than this world is to us. "I don't like death," said Davy, after a silence. "I don't want you to like what you call death, for that is not the thing itself. It is only your fancy about it. You need not think about it at all. The way to get ready for it is to live, that is, to do what you have to do." "But I do not want to get ready for it. I don't want to go to it, and to prepare for it is like going straight into it." "You will have to go to it whether you prepare for it or not. You cannot help going to it. But it must be like this world, seeing the only way to prepare for it is to do the thing God gives us to do." "Aren't you afraid of death, Mr. Grant?" "No, I am not. Why should I fear the best thing that in its time can come to me? Neither will you be afraid when it comes. It is not the dreadful thing it looks." "Why should it look dreadful if it is not dreadful?" "That is a very proper question. It looks dreadful, and must look dreadful, to everyone who cannot see in it that which alone makes life not dreadful. If you saw a great dark cloak coming along the road as if it were round somebody, but nobody inside it, you would be frightened, would you not?" "Indeed I should. It would be awful." "It would. But if you spied inside the cloak, and making it come towards you, the most beautiful loving face you ever saw, of a man carrying in his arms a little child, and saw the child clinging to him, and looking in his face with a blessed smile, would you be frightened at the black cloak?" "No, that would be silly." "You have your answer. The thing that makes death look so fearful is that we do not see inside it. Those who see only the black cloak, and think it is moving along of itself, may well be frightened. But those who see the face inside the cloak would be fools indeed to be frightened. Before Jesus came, people lived in great misery about death. But after he rose again, those who believed in him always talked of dying as falling asleep. And I dare say the story of Lazarus, though it was not such a great thing after the rising of the Lord himself, had a large share in enabling them to think that way about it. When they went home, Davy, running up to Lady Arctura's room, recounted to her, as well as he could, the conversation he had just had with Mr. Grant. "Oh, Archie," he said, "to hear him talk, you would think death hadn't a leg to stand upon." Arctura smiled, but it was a smile through a cloud of unshed tears. Lovely as death might be, she would like to get the good of this world before going to the next. As if God would deny us any good! At one time she had been willing to go, she thought, but she was not now. The world had of late grown very beautiful to her. End of chapter 60.